Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Denley Wenner. I'm the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Law and Public Policy. We are very excited to host this year's Spring Symposium on an important topic that has massive and serious consequences for us all, which is agriculture and food policy. This symposium will provide diverse perspectives to the public policy issues we see in the current and future states of agriculture. The event will further take intersectional approaches in other areas, examples being digital agriculture, free speech and animal rights, and seed technology agreements to offer critical perspectives in the wide issues spanning across agriculture and food policy. Through these discussions, this event aims to advance thoughtful dialogue and innovative policy solutions to ensure a just, equitable, and sustainable future for agriculture and food systems across the globe. First, we will begin with our first panel that will talk about technology, labor, and environmental rights in modern agriculture. Then we will introduce our second panel, focusing on rights and risks in modern agriculture. Then after a brief break, we will hear from our keynote panelist, Professor Chad Marzen, who will talk and analyze about the general potential for bipartisanship in agriculture policy during the second Trump administration, while highlighting several other relevant areas in agriculture policy. Before I turn it over to Dean Kelly, I just want to give my sincere appreciations to Dean Kelly and Dean Carpenter for their continuing support for our journal. Again, I'd like to give my continuing support to Professors Cornell and Reed for offering continuing support, guidance, and advisement to our journal. And I would like to especially thank all of the members that we have here in the audience today. You guys are very appreciated in this journal. You guys do a great job in making sure that we offer serious and critical dialogue to the legal field, and I am very grateful for all of your presence today. So with that, I will turn it over to Dean Kelly to give brief remarks.
Thanks, Denley, and let's give it up for Denley as editor-in-chief of the Journal of Law and Public Policy. So welcome everyone to this spring symposium for the Journal of Law and Public Policy. I want to echo Denley in extending my thanks to all the editors of the Journal of Law and Public Policy. You do a great job with each and every issue and symposium. And so I want to thank in a special way not only Denley, but the two symposium editors who I know do a great job, Anna Larson and Jackie Moyne. Also want to echo Denley in thanking Professor Chuck Reed and Professor Jenny Cornell, who provide steadfast faculty leadership for the journal. I was looking just at a few of the recent symposium topics. They include the path to an equitable energy transition, free speech in the U.S. Constitution, and the rule of law. So always the journal is focused on important topics, and today is no exception as we focus on agriculture and food policy. Also want to welcome all of our panelists and speakers. I know many of them are via Zoom today, so they can enjoy our wonderful campus and beautiful spring weather in the Twin Cities. But it's a real testament to the journal and to this symposium that we have speakers far and wide across the United States and even multiple speakers in Nigeria. So it is a testament to the importance of the topic, both in the United States and globally. Just want to give two quick anecdotes on its importance, which, as I was thinking about the topic, actually a childhood memory came back because my father around the dinner table was big on drilling my brother and me in basically everything. So vocabulary words, world geography, we had maps going. He was a historian, a history professor, so any kind of history. And the one question that kind of stumped there were many questions that stumped my brother and me, but one in particular came to mind, which he asked us at one point, what was the most important invention of all time? And so our minds were kind of racing to different things in technology, obviously the Industrial Revolution, there were lots of technological developments. But his answer, at least, I don't know if this is what AI would say, but his answer was that the most important invention is actually barbed wire, which kind of threw my brother and I at first because it's not the first thing that maybe comes to mind. But the reason why it was so important in his mind, and it is, I think, one of the most important technological developments, was its purpose and its effect on agriculture and in particular cattle raising. And so I looked it up again, and so barbed wire was actually patented in 1874 by an Illinois farmer. Maybe that's why he was big on it, because we were born and raised in Illinois, Joseph Glidden, who developed a double-strand wire to lock barbs in place, creating an affordable and effective solution for fencing the treeless American plains. Known as the winner, which I guess is a good if you're an invention, Glidden's invention revolutionized cattle ranching, effectively ending the open range and altering westward expansion. So that came to mind. The other thing that came to mind was actually more from my own legal studies and focus on property law, which some of you may be familiar with. Robert Ellickson, the property theorist at Yale, wrote a very important book about order without law, how neighbors settle disputes, and it was all about actually cattle ranching, raising in Shasta County, California, in which he demonstrated that sometimes the law is not the most important thing, it's social norms. So those are just two quick examples. I know today we're going to cover a range of other topics, as Denley pointed out, from environmental rights and labor, technology. Obviously, regulation is super important now to food and agriculture. And I'm very much looking forward to our keynote address as well, because we all need a little bit of bipartisanship. So the fact that food and agriculture policy is a potential topic in which there may be bipartisanship gave me an optimistic note. So just want to, again, thank everybody for being here. Welcome everybody, and with that, I'll turn it over to Blair Kirby to help us get started. So thanks everybody for being here.
Hi everyone. Our first panel of the day will explore technology, labor, and environmental issues in modern agriculture. Dr. Nancy Ngozi Nzom is a Nigerian legal practitioner and academic specializing in employment law, digital labor governance, and regulatory policy. She's the founder and director of the Zinago Institute for Policy and Socio-Legal Research and holds a PhD in employment law. Daniel Moses Eyazo is a lecturer at Nasarawa State University, KEFI, and a PhD candidate in labor and employment law. His research focuses on workers' rights and regulatory reform in Nigeria. Our final speaker in this panel, Dr. Eric Booth, has a master's in applied philosophy from Bowling Green State University, a PhD in philosophy from Marquette University, a JD and an LLM from the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Booth was a foreign language and area studies fellow at the University of Wisconsin and a Fulbright scholar to Tanzania, where he helped start a Catholic college and law program. Dr. Booth's research on property rights, human rights, and the rights of women and smallholder farmers helped reshape land tenure law in Tanzania. He served as special legal counsel to the president of the International Law Division of the African Union and has negotiated land and water rights for the Maasai. As a Fulbright scholar, he has helped develop law programs in Tanzania, Lithuania, and Kazakhstan, and assisted in constitutional revisions in Kenya and for the Blackfeet tribe in Browning, Montana. He has taught law, philosophy, ethics, and religious studies on 4 continents and has dedicated much of his professional career to law and poverty issues, human rights, and Catholic education. Please join me in welcoming our first panel.
Professor Nizam and Professor Eyazo, welcome to the University of St. Thomas. A very important topic. We all need to eat. It's the it's what keeps us alive and able to do things. So I'm looking greatly forward to your presentation. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Good day, everyone, and I bring greetings from Nigeria. Thank you for this opportunity. My co-author, Dr. Daniel Eyazo, and I have examined how digital technology is changing agriculture and what this actually means for farm workers especially in developing countries like ours here. So what is happening in agriculture? Agriculture is no longer the manual work which we know. It's now supported by technology, such as you see AI, you see what AI is doing. You also see that the digital labor platforms are there. Also biometric monitoring system, tools that track workers' performance. So these are, for example, I would actually give a scenario what I mean by this. A large farm, he used AI system to decide how many workers are needed. So this was not the situation before. Before now, it wasn't the situation, but now AI is here. AI is now being used to detect a whole lot of things. Workers now are now being hired by mobile applications instead of directly or even by farm managers. So you could see some workers, some farm workers now use like fingerprints of actually our facial recognition system to monitor attendance. So these technology are said to improve efficiency and productivity. Yes, it's actually there and is actually doing a lot of changes, making the work easier, even making the work more efficient. But if you look at all these, you could see, but we would ask ourselves one question: notwithstanding the technologies there, making the work efficient, also the productivity for us. One of the questions we would ask is, what happens to farm workers when machines and algorithm now make decisions about their jobs? So before now, you could see that managers make this decision themselves. But now there's algorithm is there, there's machines there making these decisions for them. So we know that when these machines are there, discrimination comes. So how do we monitor these discriminations? How are all this done? So one main argument which we're looking at is digital technology is increasing control over workers. Yes, it's there. It has come to stay. But breaking traditional work, yes, that's what's breaking traditional work, breaking the relationships workers have, and also reducing labor protections. So these are the things digital technology is actually doing to agriculture workers now. Today, many farm workers are managed through online platforms. Apart from the online platforms, you could also see performance scoring system, the performance appraiser, which had been done manually, but now AI is taking place and doing all this. For instance, a worker may receive messages telling them to come to work based on algorithm, not a woman supervisor. So now workers may be reduced based on how fast they harvest crops. And low sources can reduce these chances of getting future works. So a worker may also suddenly stop receiving job offers on platforms without explanations. You can see that these platforms are actually reducing the workers, reducing these job offers at no explanation. Before this algorithm were there, we had issues, we had situations where explanations were given for every decisions. But now workers are not receiving workers are not having that opportunity anymore. So this system are often not transparent. Workers may not understand. Workers may actually not understand why they are being paid a certain wage. Workers are also not even going to understand why their working hours has changed. Workers also may also lose or even gain access to their jobs. So why this actually happens, why this is actually particular to developing countries like ours, because this problem is actually more serious in developing countries because many workers are actually having informal jobs. In Nigeria, for instance, the law does not protect informal workers. It's just for the formal workers. So these workers passing through this discrimination, where do they go to? How do they help themselves? Labor laws are not strongly enforced here. In as much as the labor laws are there, but it's not strongly enforced. It's not actually favoring the informal workers here. Workers are already having economic hardship. So the hardship is already a whole lot. And you could see them accepting what they are not meant to accept. For instance, now, you could see them not even asking questions because issues like, oh, if you're going to ask questions, we're going to terminate your jobs. So all this is happening now. There's no protection for them. So this problem is like, for example, I'll give us an example with Nigeria and also not just Nigeria, also a lot of developing countries in Africa, what we have to pass around. You see a seasonal farm workers in Nigeria or Kenya, for instance, depending entirely on digital platform for daily work, with no contract, no job security. If the system blocks them or reduces their rating, they may lose their only source of income immediately. So how do they find help? Where do they go to? Who helps them? These people do not have provisions for the government. They don't have provisions. So where do they actually go from? So this is the legal problem we have here. Current laws are not prepared for the new system of digital labor management. Our current laws is not actually amended or even prepared for what is before us right now. And that's actually the main issues we are having now. There's actually a gap. There's a gap in our labor law. There's a gap in agricultural law. There's a gap in our data protection, workplace surveillance, and employment. Because of this gap, labor laws may protect workers from unfair dismissal, yes. But what happens when the computer system deactivates these workers? Where do they go to? Where do they go to? Where do they run for help? Data protection laws, yes, exist. Yes, no doubt about that. But workers may often do not know how this data is collected or used. So if they do not know how this data is collected or used, where do they go for? That's one. The issue is not all about the workers. Digital agriculture is affecting food system, the supply chain. It's also affecting the market power. I'll use, for instance, a large agri-business company can use data and AI to control production. They can also use to also control pricing and even labor at the same time. Small farmers who do not have access to this technology may be pushed out of the market because they don't have access to this technology. And getting this technology is not free. Most of them they don't even have enough income for themselves, talk more of even having access to even have this technology, to have this technology to be for benefit for them. So these are the things, and what I also look at now is the recommendation. Yes, these issues are there. Everything is happening. So what is the recommendation? How do we help? How do we help the system? How do we help? How do we help the system? How can workers not be affected with all this? So one of the things I've looked at is transparency. Workers should understand how these decisions are made. For instance, platforms should explain to workers their rating, why their rating drops. Also, why they are not being assigned to jobs. They shouldn't be blacklisted. They should be made to understand how these decisions are made and how they got to this stage. Also, the right to organize. Farm workers on digital platforms should be able to join unions. They should be able to join unions. Example, platform workers should be allowed to form association and also negotiate for fair conditions. Notwithstanding their informal workers, they should also be given that right and opportunities. Also, the stronger labor inspection. Government should improve the monitoring of working conditions. Labor inspectors should look at the digital system used in farms, not just physical conditions. Yes, the system is there, making the work accessible, but it still needs to be monitored. They still need to be monitored. It shouldn't be left all like that. And because if it's not being monitored, you can see that some people are unfairly dismissed and they're not being protected. Also, better laws. We also looked at the labor laws should include agriculture and technology policies. For example, laws should be clearly define the laws should clearly define the rights of platform farm workers. It should give them the opportunity and their rights. And if they have issues, where do they go to? They should make them understand that they can still get protected, notwithstanding the technology is there. They make them understand the benefit of this technology and why this technology is important. In conclusion, I will also say that digital technology has a lot of benefits. Yes, it has a lot of benefits, but it also creates serious risks for workers, not just anyhow workers, but agricultural workers. If it's not properly regulated, it can lead to job insecurity. It can also lead to unfair treatment. It can also lead to the increase in quality. To build a fair and sustainable food system, we must ensure that the fair treatment is for all workers, formal or informal, agricultural workers. It must be fair to everyone. And also the protection of rights. Their rights has to be assured that digitalization has come, but this digitalization is actually going to protect their rights. Inclusion of everyone, vulnerable groups, and everyone has to be included in these laws. It shouldn't be the laws for just some set of people. It shouldn't be for those who are in the large-scale agricultural business. No, it should be for everyone, even for the large agricultural business and also for the small agricultural business. Technology should support workers and not weaken their rights. Thank you very much.
Professor Nzom, thank you. I have some questions and comments on your presentation, but maybe we save those until we hear from our next panelist. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Eric,
Good
welcome back to
morning.
St. Thomas.
Yes, thank you so much. So happy to be accepted for this very important conference. I've got to share my screen here if that's possible. Absolutely thrilled to be part of this. So glad that you're hosting this important topic. I think, as was stated from the outset, none of us are going to get by without food. So, very important and timely topic. My team and I, which consists of my two daughters, we have two lawyers and a plant pathologist on the team, and we focused on glyphosate. And no conference on agriculture and food policy would be complete without talking about the Monsanto Corporation, largest biotech firm in the world, and their impact on agriculture in the United States is, well, let's put it this way, nothing short than monopolistic. They are really dominating the agricultural field, no pun intended. And so what we've done is we've focused on this. You'll notice from the title that at the end we get around to talking about the golf industry, but that's not really the main focus. The main focus is the Armageddon that we kind of predict in our research from the impacts of glyphosate. And again, very important for considerations in agriculture and food to talk about glyphosate. The history of glyphosate is fascinating. The paper that we've put together has a detailed history of Monsanto's corporation, beginning with DDT. They were the largest producer of DDT in the world, and as DDT fell out of favor throughout the 60s because of Rachel Carson, Monsanto led the charge to discredit her and really kind of wrote the book on how to generate false science. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the context of today's presentation, but not so much the history of DDT, because when DDT was then banned worldwide, Monsanto was at the ready with its replacement, and the replacement was glyphosate. And so that's kind of the important factor there, is that Monsanto maintained their dominance in the field, knowing that DDT was going to be falling out of favor, and then being able to replace it very quickly with what we now have seen is a more pernicious chemical to begin with. So not a particularly complex chemical, as I understand from my daughter who's studying plant pathology, but a tremendously effective chemical. And the one thing that Monsanto learned from the DDT debacle was they needed to protect their interests by using patent law very aggressively. And so they have been kind of the leaders in using patent law to their advantage and making sure that their product and only their product, and then hence their genetically modified seeds, are going to dominate the market. So the interesting aspect of glyphosate is that it really only makes up a portion of a jug of Roundup or a barrel of Roundup. And one of the issues that comes up with regard to the use of glyphosate is the fact that glyphosate itself is pernicious and has a deleterious effect on organisms, but the surfactants that are in there to make it work actually make glyphosate more effective but more dangerous, and those surfactants have been largely ignored in terms of Roundup's composition. So what we're looking at here is the world's most prolific pesticide. It comes under 20 different trademark names. And my personal favorite for trademark names, aside from all of these really creative ones, is Touchdown. So they're marketing glyphosate. All of these different trade names are what you call glyphosate-based herbicides. So they're GBHs, and Monsanto controls all of those because they have the patent on glyphosate. Again, it's the most prolific pesticide in the world. Since 1974, when it was registered with the EPA, we've used 20 billion pounds as a human community. So on this particular image, the areas that are in tan are the areas where the most glyphosate is being used in the world. What's interesting is 75% of the glyphosate used in the world has occurred in the last 10 years. The United States, of course, is using more glyphosate than anybody. We're using 150,000 tons per year. That's about 300 million pounds, which is dumped on about 300 million acres. It's used on 90% of our soybeans, our corn, our cotton. It's also used on alfalfa, sugar beets, canola, cranberries, oranges, apples, cherries, beans. One of the troubling factors is that they've been given clearance by the EPA to go ahead and use glyphosate as a desiccant, even on non-genetically modified crops. So at the end of the crop cycle, when you want to get the most produce and have a uniform harvest, they spray the entire field with glyphosate to bring everything to maturation at the same time, and that increases their yields. However, that glyphosate is sprayed directly on the seed right before it goes into production. So particularly dangerous practice that's going on. We also use about 12.5 million tons, and this is one of the overlooked areas of glyphosate. While 90% of glyphosate is used in agriculture for food products, we're using 21 million pounds a year on golf courses and parking lots, borders, city parks, athletic fields, trails, playgrounds. And again, about 75% of all glyphosate used since 74 has been used in the last decade. So our amounts, you can see from the graph on the left, are steadily increasing. One of the reasons that glyphosate use is increasing is because it's actually failing. There are certain weeds now that have developed a natural resistance to it, and so each year farmers have to use more and more of it, and it's kind of starting to backfire. And you can see from the image on the right where the concentrations of glyphosate are. This is particularly troubling because Iowa, as a state, you may have seen in the news the last couple of months, they suddenly woke up in 2026 and realized, oh my gosh, we have the second highest cancer rates in the United States. What the heck is going on? And what's sad is because they're an agricultural state and they have been propagandized by Monsanto, they are not making the connection to glyphosate. They're talking about nitrates in the water and E. coli and other things, but there has not been a steady dedication to the research on the effects of glyphosate. So you can see for the Missouri River Valley, the Mississippi watershed, the Ohio watershed, those areas of agriculture, that's where the most glyphosate is being used. Basically, glyphosate is in everything. It's not only in our food products, and sadly, I discovered it's in our beer, but it's also in our clothes. It's also in people's homes. The recent tests have shown that 60% of our air samples and rainwater samples have glyphosate in them, and that's 100% in the Midwest. So when they did these tests in the Midwest, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, 100% of the rainwater samples already had glyphosate in them. 60% of all surface waters got glyphosate, 80% of all wastewater, so that means it's passing through humans in terms of their urine. They did a study in Indiana and found 90% of pregnant women had glyphosate in their bloodstreams. And strangely, 100% of people tested in Oregon had glyphosate in their bloodstreams. Again, it's in our clothes, it's in our hygiene products, it's in diapers, anything with cotton fibers, and also because of drift, which is when the chemical, floats on the air, it ends up in people's houses who happen to be living close to agricultural areas, farm fields, and even parks and golf courses. How did this campaign get so much momentum? And the answer is, well, it's from a company, Monsanto, which was in their heyday producing more DDT than any other company on earth. And they were in collusion with the federal government during the 1940s and 50s to spread DDT everywhere. It was ubiquitous. And they even had the government doing their advertising and marketing for them. There's an old film out about DDT and how it was used in public demonstrations. We even had the government that was pushing it very aggressively and setting up demonstrations where children were sitting at a table having lunch outside, and it showed them being gassed with DDT. That campaign was headed up by Monsanto, and so they learned how to make things find favor with the American public without the public being aware of its dangers. And again, one of the things they did was, in the aftermath of World War II, anything you could do to connect your farm chemicals, your pesticides, your fertilizers, your herbicides, anything you could do to connect it to the war effort or America as the country that was going to liberate the world in terms of agriculture after World War II made it very popular. So there's kind of this notion of false patriotism attached to certain products. Then Monsanto also made sure that they presented this chemical as totally friendly. So they have advertising campaigns showing people in their backyard using spray bottles, and then they say, well, you don't even need to wear protective equipment, although this individual has protective equipment. You don't need that. You can just go out in your flip-flops and your shorts and spray it all over your yard. And again, they led the most aggressive false information campaign of any corporation. When I teach here, I teach at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado, and I spend 4 weeks in my class on Monsanto Corporation alone, just in terms of them having the most aggressive legal department of any corporation I'm aware of, and constantly filling the scholarly void with false information and with basically propaganda about how great their products are. And we'll talk more about their history of malfeasance in a second, but they have been very successful at making sure they keep their products on the tip of people's tongues without people knowing the real dangers behind the products. And again, once you attach something to food is crucial for the human community, and so they just have really gotten a free pass on a lot of their activities. One of the things they've done, and you may have seen this advertisement on a bulletin board or a billboard, even in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, the farm states. Basically, this is a very popular billboard paid for by Monsanto. And what they're trying to do is get individual states to pass legislation that will protect Monsanto from all future lawsuits. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it has been a very successful campaign up to this point, basically saying you got to leave the chemical corporations alone because we're feeding the world. So don't meddle in our affairs. Where we stand right now is really at a crossroads. The Supreme Court has accepted a case called the Durnell case, which they're going to decide this term. And I don't think I'm exaggerating by saying this could actually determine the fate of the world from at least our perspective, given the pernicious effect of glyphosate on the human body, which we'll talk about in a second. The outcome of this case is absolutely huge. What's interesting is it follows on the heels of multiple defeats in court, both state and federal courts, for Monsanto. They have already settled 100,000 lawsuits over Roundup. That's cost them $11 billion. They have 65,000 more plaintiffs in the pipeline that are probably going to join the multi-district litigation. And they're talking about setting aside $7.5 billion to settle those 65,000 cases, but they won't have to if the Supreme Court decides in their favor in the Durnell case. And so what's interesting is you look at the trajectory of the cases and you look at these massive awards that have been added, like the Piliad case awarded $2 billion to an elderly couple in California. And that's punitive damages. Now, the courts are trying to send an absolute signal here. And the reason that the punitive damages are just off the charts is because of Monsanto's consistent history of malfeasance. The things they have done are just unbelievable. And so the court is trying to send a clear message here that you cannot profit from your own misdeeds, which is a standard axiom in American jurisprudence. But they have profited from their own misdeeds for decades. And they're now being called to task. So the Durnell case is going to decide whether or not Monsanto gets a free pass and all of these litigation is going to be dismissed because they are preempted under federal law. And it's going to be really setting the stage for the future use of Monsanto. Their argument, I won't read the entire thing to you. I apologize. I've overcrowded my slides, but I use these for my students, and that way they have access to them and use them as notes. The basic argument that Monsanto is putting forward is you have to give us an exemption from lawsuit because the EPA determined that glyphosate is not likely to be a carcinogenic. That's their basic position is, hey, the EPA said we could use this. We registered it with them and they didn't require us to put a cancer warning on the label, and therefore we're good to go. They also then claim that the cancer warnings themselves are unnecessary because the chemical was registered under FIFRA, and a state can't make stricter rules about using a chemical than the federal government has. And so that is really going to destroy this cooperative federalism that we've had. And one of the things that it exploits is it exploits the basic nature of FIFRA in the first place. So the plaintiff's arguments is, wait a second, you can't say that you are off the hook simply because the EPA went ahead and registered your chemical, when the fact of the matter is your registration process was a pack of lies. You absolutely used fraud and deceit and false science in 1974, and you continued to use that same false science for the next 40 years in getting your product re-registered. And so you cannot claim that the EPA shares the burden when you didn't give them the right information. And again, part of the problem here is that FIFRA has always been a very, very weak standard. It was brought about in 1947 because there was a massive swing in the production of pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers during the uptick in American agriculture in our attempt to feed the world. And so FIFRA was brought about simply as a mechanism for registration. It was never given an enforcement arm. It was never given any power to require anything of the corporations. And what's interesting is the way FIFRA is written, it absolutely relies on the good faith of the corporations to share their information and their science with the federal government so they could be registered. And they also included in FIFRA a cost-benefit analysis because everybody knew that pesticides were dangerous. I mean, if this stuff will kill bugs and kill weeds, it's likely to do bad things to humans and to animals and to the biosphere. And so there's an accepted level. I mean, there's a tolerance for the amount of damage that these chemicals do, and it's a cost-benefit analysis. So the counter argument back at Monsanto is you can't say that, you're okay to continue poisoning the world with this chemical when your registration process didn't include your own science about how bad it is. You exploited the weakness of FIFRA. So FIFRA, again, was updated, has been updated regularly. As recently as 2017, the EPA was mandated to determine only whether a pesticide will perform its intended function. So with regard to glyphosate, of course, it does perform its intended function very well. The question is, what constitutes unreasonable adverse effects? The unreasonable portion is, again, part of what the EPA is measuring, but the EPA is always in a state of flux because it is under the purview of the federal government. And so there can be changes made to the EPA that just constantly challenge their ability to look at things in depth. And so they really don't have the ability. They're understaffed. They don't have enough scientists on board. They're underfunded, and they cannot possibly keep up with testing at a level that would determine the real adverse effects in the environment. So again, they rely on the goodwill of corporations to be forthcoming in their research and in their science. And that just has not proven to be a very effective model. I mean, the European Union looks at us and says, what are you doing? Why would you let corporations tell you whether their chemical is safe or not? Of course, they're going to tell you it's safe, and then you're going to have problems. Bottom line is that is the legal structure that we've opted for as a nation. We protect our corporations very aggressively, and that's the price that we end up paying. So under FIFRA and under the EPA, there is no specific mandated procedure for how they must record and report their science, and the EPA takes that out in good faith, and all they require is that you use good laboratory practices. The one catch is, and this is what's going to come up in the trial, the Durnell trial with the Supreme Court, is that FIFRA does have it in their policy that any information regarding the unreasonable adverse effects of a chemical, any information that a corporation might happen unto or discover over the decades is supposed to be reported back to them, to the federal government immediately, and they're supposed to re-register the chemical. Now, this is really crucial because this is something that Monsanto absolutely avoided doing. They did have information throughout the 40-year period that they were pushing this very aggressively, that the chemical was producing some bad results. There were some lab tests done by independent agencies. Even a world organization that studies cancer came out with a study that said this stuff is actually really bad. They never tried to re-register with the new information. So they clearly violated the spirit of FIFRA. Where did glyphosate come from? A little interesting background for you. The Stauffer Chemical Company patented glyphosate in 1961. The essence of it as a chemical is it's a chelating agent, which means it draws heavy metals to itself. So it was invented to clear the rust out of boilers and off of pipes. That's its original intended purpose. The Stauffer Company, however, was based in Tarpon Springs, Florida, and this chemical was so pernicious and so bad that it destroyed the air, the water, the land all around Tarpon Springs. Basically, because of the Stauffer Chemical Company, Tarpon Springs became a Superfund cleanup site. Well, Monsanto was Johnny on the spot, and they grabbed that patent from the Stauffer Chemical Company, and in 1968, they patented it as a herbicide. Now, the reason they patent it as a herbicide is because it's a chelating agent. So when you spray that on the ground, for instance, the glyphosate goes in the ground, it draws all of the minerals and heavy metals to itself, which starves the plant. The plant can't feed itself. It's not getting any of the important minerals that it needs for its metabolic processes. What's interesting is in 2010, Monsanto repatented glyphosate as an antibiotic, which tells us clearly that they knew as a corporation, antibiotic, anti-life, they knew that this stuff would kill everything that it touches. The way that it does it is when it's sprayed on the leaves of the plant, it goes into the cellular structure of the plant. And basically what glyphosate does is it blocks the phosphate molecule, which is what's important for the plant to continue photosynthesis. So it kills the plant from the top down. And then the glyphosate that hits the ground starves the root structure from any of its valuable minerals. So it's a two-pronged attack. It kills it at the cellular level, but it also kills it at the nutritional level in the roots. Basically, to sum it up, glyphosate blocking that phosphate molecule derails the entire process of the shikimate pathway, which is crucial to plants. Now, the argument that Monsanto made when this came up in 1976, again in 1981, again in 1986, they kept pounding the drum that glyphosate is entirely safe for human beings and animals because human beings and animals don't have a shikimate pathway. We don't do photosynthesis. We're safe. We could darn near drink the stuff and be okay because it can't interfere with the shikimate pathway that we don't have. But what they were absolutely obfuscating about is the fact that all of the gut biomes we have do share in the shikimate pathway. So basically, when glyphosate goes into our body, it's killing our gut biome. And when you kill off the gut biome, you cannot assimilate the amino acids to form the polypeptide bonds, to form the proteins that you need as a biological organism to live and to thrive. So it is absolutely deadly to humans, but you can't make the claim that glyphosate causes cancer. It actually just causes the death of your gut biome. Well, when your gut biome dies, these are the diseases that occur. So glyphosate is, responsible in some ways for all of these diseases. Now, one of the strategies that Monsanto used as a corporation was to derail the entire argument against glyphosate by saying you can't prove glyphosate causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And all of those lawsuits I showed you previously where the billions of dollars were handed out in punitive damages, every single one of those lawsuits focused only on glyphosate causing non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. But we're overlooking the broader issues with glyphosate. When we know that it kills bacteria at a certain level, and that's the bacteria that's in our digestive processes, then all of these diseases become a possibility for human beings. And you can look at this list and say, wow, 40 years ago, most of these were not even an issue in America. And today, these things are absolutely at issue, not just here in America now, but worldwide. And the common denominator is glyphosate. What's even more troubling is glyphosate is having a negative impact on the positive gut biome, but there are some bacteria that it actually builds up and strengthens, and some of them are like MRSA. So that is really dangerous to the human community if we're producing and strengthening these things that are antibiotic resistant. So This chemical is, it's diabolical, as some people have said, including Sefton, who is a MIT senior research scientist who has put out a book on glyphosate called Toxic Legacy. And it is really a good book to read, but it'll scare you because glyphosate is so prolific and it's in everybody's bloodstream. Then, the conclusion is pretty clear. You're looking at, the possibility of killing your gut biome and opening yourself up to any of these diseases. So how much did Monsanto know in 1974 when they first sought registration with the newly formed EPA? Well, the fact of the matter is, initially, as a corporation, they warned farmers, don't use this stuff everywhere. Spray selectively. This stuff is a scorched earth pesticide. It'll kill everything. So in their own history with this chemical, at one time they did warn people not to use it. Well, once they developed their Roundup Ready seed stocks, they switched gears and then began to tell farmers to use it indiscriminately. History behind their faulty and fraudulent registration starts with 1971 when their own scientist, Dr. Paul Wright, resigned his position at Monsanto, took a job working for IBT in Northbrook, Illinois, which provided the testing for chemicals for about 60% of all chemicals in America. They were huge. It was a huge testing facility. Monsanto then contracted with IBT in 72 for the research, which was directed by Paul Wright at IBT. Then Dr. Wright, after they finished the research on Monsanto's glyphosate, returned to Monsanto in 73. Roundup was registered in 74. The problem is the research that they did at IBT was all fraudulent. Absolutely fraudulent. It was one of the biggest scientific frauds ever committed in the United States, if not the world. The glyphosate registration was based on long-term animal cancer studies. Those were all fraudulent. Literally every one of the rats that was tested at IBT died. When investigators went into the IBT facilities, there were so many dead rats that they were all laying in their cages and oozing purple slime out of their bodies. It was unbelievable. The accounts of it are just gut-wrenching. Even Monsanto's own head of product safety, Dr. William Hayden's, called the IBT data completely fraudulent. The EPA ordered Monsanto to redo the tests. And the focus of it became then the criminal trial of Dr. Paul Wright, who eventually was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the fraud. Again, it was the most massive scientific fraud ever committed in the United States. And Monsanto was the beneficiary in the sense that they got to really put their stamp on all the research and make the claims that glyphosate was completely safe, and that's the basis for the registration of it with the EPA in 1974. So going back to their current position in litigation, they're claiming you can't hold us liable because the EPA gave us a stamp of approval and allowed us to market this and sell it for 50 years without putting a cancer warning on it. Therefore, it's on the EPA. And the EPA's response and the plaintiff's response is, yes, but you lied in the original registration. There was no real science done with regard to the cancer-causing possibilities of glyphosate. What happened to Dr. Wright? Well, he was given constant merit raises at Monsanto in 77, 78, 80, 82, and Monsanto paid all of his legal defense for $1.4 million. And then he was given full retirements with a 1-month severance package when he went to jail. And after he got out of jail, they provided him employment services to get a new job. So they take care of their own. They continued to cite that fraudulent IBT study in 83 and 85, and even as recently as 2018 during the re-registration process, they referred to the same faulty science, claiming that glyphosate does not cause cancerous tumors in rats. It can't do that because rats don't have a Shikimate pathway. And yet there weren't really any valid studies done until 1983. And when those studies showed that glyphosate absolutely caused kidney tumors in mice, then Monsanto went on the defensive, hired their own toxicologist to come in and say, oh, that's not true. Even the control group of rats had tumors, and so the study's false. We don't have to listen to it. What's interesting is the EPA at that time classified glyphosate as a possible oncogen. Now, an oncogen is precancerous cells that are multiplying so rapidly that they can only ever turn into cancer. But that's not the same as saying it causes cancer. It just causes this process whereby your cells start dividing so rapidly that they become really susceptible to cancer. Again, in 85 and 86, Monsanto continued to fight against the EPA ruling. They spent millions and millions of dollars getting politicians in their pocket and running smear campaigns against all the scientists in the world that were writing against glyphosate. It was a very, very productive process for them. The question is, though, how much did the EPA actually know, and were they complicitous in turning a blind eye to Monsanto's machinations? And some of that has to actually raise the question whether or not we're looking at a captured industry, and whether or not the legislation that is coming out is completely derived from Monsanto, and that. If we establish that is very tragic in its own right. But the collusion is kind of unquestionable at this point. In the late 1990s, Monsanto also ran its own study again on the rats to see if there was any real definite link, which they did find. And their scientist, James Perry, said not only does glyphosate cause cancer in the rats, it's genotoxic, which means some of the rats that are fed glyphosate won't develop cancer, but their offspring will. And that becomes really scary for the human community when we look at the amount of glyphosate that is in the environment currently. And, taking into consideration that it's genotoxic, that is really a scary alternative for human beings. Nonetheless, Monsanto dismissed its own scientists, and they wrote lots of reports against Dr. James Perry and made the claim that Monsanto Roundup basically is not a carcinogen because we haven't actually done any testing on it to prove whether it's a carcinogen. So we can't say that, but we can say that glyphosate is not a carcinogen. So back to that same old argument, which is, okay, maybe Roundup is toxic because of the surfactants in Roundup, which we know are cancer causing and allowed to be in there because it's not the active ingredient. The EPA only studies the active ingredient, but maybe the surfactants are what's driving the cancer relationship. But we shouldn't say that it's glyphosate, because again, glyphosate can't cause cancer because it only affects the Shikimate pathway. So historically, going all the way back to Monsanto's run with DDT, they are an organization that has really participated in some shady dealings. They are very effective about paying for influence from politicians, paying universities and professors to promote and defend their products, partnering with third-party influencers. They even set up phony 501c3 nonprofits that look like they're doing great things for promoting health and promoting different emphasis on nutrition. The reality of it is they're undermining it all. All of this is in the Monsanto papers, which were produced after the Johnson litigation in 2018. If you haven't read the Monsanto papers, it's a chilling account of how one corporation's malfeasance has, led to the death and destruction of a lot of people in the real world. They have managed to place important people in very high-ranking positions, including the fact that Clarence Thomas sits on the Supreme Court and was formerly a Monsanto attorney. And this is really advantageous to them. In spite of all of the negative books and articles and science that has been produced against Monsanto, they remain in control of their own destiny in terms of their influence politically and legally. Their ghostwriting campaign was absolutely shocking. They literally were churning out false science on a regular basis and paying high-ranking scientists at institutions to put their name on this. The ghostwriting campaign is one of the main reasons that the Pilliod and the Johnson courts hit Monsanto with such high punitive damages, because the history of their behavior is just egregious. What's really sad is they started their own academic journal, but made no association with it, did not really let anybody know they were behind it. And that organization, Academics Review, was responsible for producing false science. They came out with articles that said things that were so ridiculous, like, oh, glyphosate is not any worse than salt, sugar, or water, or nutmeg, or licorice. Anything in a high dose will make you sick. And so it's unfair of anybody to say that glyphosate is bad, because it's just like any of these other household products. Again, their obfuscation and prevarication around glyphosate is just shocking. The individual agency in the world that produced a report on glyphosate saying that it was probably a carcinogen was attacked vociferously by Monsanto, and this scientist basically had his career ruined by them because he proved conclusively that rats that were exposed to glyphosate do develop cancerous tumors. I won't go through the whole history of how they got started, but their track record as a corporation is just appalling. They have been responsible for some of the worst chemicals ever invented, and they have, in regular situations, avoided lots of litigation, even while people are, getting sick and dying. Again, I would recommend if you're interested, the Monsanto Papers. It's a case study unto itself about corporate malfeasance and false information and false science. Well worth the read. One of the things to consider again is what is this collusion between the government and Monsanto, and how is it that the cost benefit analysis on an agricultural pesticide outweighs the health and well-being of human beings, especially now on a global level, because glyphosate is the most prolific pesticide used in the world. One of the things to consider is, well, maybe there's just a profit motive here, and Monsanto now with the genetically modified seed stock are consistently raising prices for American farmers and for farmers around the world. Once they get locked onto this petrochemical cycle and they're using glyphosate regularly, they have to buy all of their seed stock from Monsanto. It's driving up corporate profits immensely, but that might not be the only agenda with Monsanto. They have a track record of being associated with the military-industrial complex, and with 90% of the world's patents on genetically modified organisms. The question that comes about, which we don't tackle in our paper and our research, of course, it's too politically volatile, but is Monsanto really responsible for using food as a political weapon going forward? Is that really maybe the hidden agenda here? One thing to consider is while the litigation Durnell is pending and the Supreme Court's going to make its decision, the Trump administration didn't wait for that decision to be made by the Supreme Court. They just immediately signed an executive order protecting glyphosate and Bayer Monsanto from all future litigation. North Dakota and Georgia and Kentucky all got their state legislatures to pass Monsanto protection bills. South Dakota, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Missouri are states whose legislatures are considering doing the same thing. And what they're doing is protecting Monsanto ahead of a possible negative decision from the Supreme Court. So one way or the other, Monsanto is going to get protection and be able to continue doing what they're doing. No surprise, Center for Public Integrity shows that Monsanto has pledged $8 billion to U.S. Ag. They gave $1.25 million to Trump's inauguration fund. And over the years, they have given over $31 million to various politicians to make sure that they keep getting legislation that is friendly to their bottom line. And again, this kind of looks like a tailor-made case of captured policy. Again, where did Monsanto get its beginnings? With DDT. This is just a picture of one of the public demonstrations that they put together as a PR campaign. I mean, I just always have to ask, what were the people thinking when they're spraying children in a public swimming pool with DDT? How it just doesn't make any sense. Like what bugs do you have in a public swimming pool that you got to gas kids? But these are the kind of demonstrations that Monsanto set up and established. And again, it was collusion with the government to help get rid of their product using federal tax dollars to basically subsidize private industry and their products. So the question then becomes, is glyphosate really the new DDT? And is that the goal to make sure that it goes global? And is it going to be used as a weapon? Now we get around to the last part, which is we went after golf courses because, well, number one, everybody in my family loves golf. And number two, backstory is one of my daughters was a Division I golfer. And in her first season of golf, 3 of her teammates all developed cancerous tumors, and they're the same tumors that those rats had. So she started doing her own research, and that's how we got onto this topic and decided to run with it. But golf courses are in a particularly bad position in terms of the use of glyphosate. Golf courses About 2.2 million acres of land in the United States are dedicated to golf courses. They're using 300,000 gallons of water per day, and they're using 7 to 9 pounds of pesticides per acre. Now, that's just pesticides, not fertilizers. Pesticides per acre, 7 to 9 pounds per acre per year. That's about 150 million pounds per year in the United States alone. They're using 7 to 8 times more glyphosate than crop use. So golf courses are really ramping it up in terms of the spread of glyphosate. In general, American golf courses use 15 times more than European golf courses. Obviously, European Union way more concerned about chemicals and chemical usage. But if their golf courses can function with so much less, then we think ours could too. What's interesting is there was a study done recently. You may have seen it. It was very scary because it was based on people living in Minnesota and Wisconsin within 1 mile of golf courses. And the study showed that they're 126% more likely to get Parkinson's disease. Now, if you remember, one of the things that glyphosate does, when glyphosate goes into the human body, it's a chelating agent. So it will draw to itself all of the heavy metals, but it also seeks the lowest portion of your body that has the lowest pH. It likes acidic environments. So glyphosate will grab all the heavy metals, get in your bloodstream, and then go to your brain because the brain has the lowest pH. That's where glyphosate is the most comfortable. Sadly, glyphosate is 1 million times more effective at accumulating aluminum than any other chemical. So it grabs a hold of aluminum and it gets in your bloodstream, takes it right to your brain. Well, we know now that aluminum is a direct relationship to Parkinson's, to dementia, to Alzheimer's. So there's really a strong connection here that people should really pay attention to. Again, back to the golf courses, there's 1,950 golf courses in the United States that are in planned golf communities. So that's 3 million homes that are sitting on golf courses. That's 6 to 10 million people who live right there in proximity to the course. There's another 10 to 15 million people within a mile. And so the drift when these pesticides are sprayed does go beyond a mile. So that is definitely having an effect on a lot of people. There's 350,000 golf course workers who are breathing these chemicals on a regular basis. They're sprayed 2-3 times a week. There's 30 million golfers who are exposed to these chemicals. Most golf courses do not shut down for 24 hours when they spray glyphosate. They let people golf the same day. So we've been on golf courses where you can see piles of white foam sitting on the fairway. And people are walking through this, hitting their ball through it, picking up the ball. So there's a real problem here. Total, there's going to be 50 to 60 million people directly affected by the glyphosate on golf courses, with 100 million people indirectly affected. And so we think this is a particular problem. And as a matter of the litigation going forward, if the Supreme Court decides in favor of Monsanto and says, okay, you're preempted under federal law, the EPA approved you, it's not your fault, go ahead. They might require them, as they have done with paraquat, to put a cancer warning on the label. That's not really going to affect their use in agricultural areas because we're so dependent upon glyphosate in major agriculture. But what would happen to the independently owned golf courses who are still spreading glyphosate? They will not get an exemption like Monsanto. So there's going to be a real problem in the future for 50 to 60 million people who are living and working on these golf courses and golfing on them. They're not going to get a federal protection. And so one of the things that needs to happen is somebody has to educate the golf industry about what's happening with the litigation and what the possibilities are after the fact. If the Supreme Court decides against Monsanto, the golf courses will be in trouble for another reason, because if this chemical is outlawed, they don't have a backup chemical to switch. And so the pristine nature of our courses, as you can see by these pictures, is probably going to be sacrificed unless somebody invents an alternative that's non-toxic. So either way the Supreme Court decides in the Durnell case, golf courses are going to get caught in the crosshairs. And they need a backup plan sooner rather than later. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present on this. I hope it was at least a little bit informative.
Dr. Booth, thank you. And we have time, I think, for 2 quick questions. One question directed to each of our presenters. I'll begin with Professor Nizam. And Professor Nizam, I think you've put your finger on some very, very large issues globally. We live in a neoliberal international order, and we've seen a power shift dramatically in the direction of companies. Digital technology only enhances that shift in power. And the question you raise is the question of how do we counteract that shift in power. She's not here? Oh.
Yeah, I'm here on her behalf.
Well, I'll ask you the question then. The question then is simply how do we counteract this shift in power? And I thought one feature of your proposal in particular seemed very intriguing to me, and that is the idea of unionization, labor organization, as a counterbalancing mechanism. Would you care to comment on that? And then I will pose a quick question to Dr. Booz, knowing that we have a panel scheduled very, very quickly, and that is the following. We've seen population in the United States, population has doubled since 1960. Worldwide, I think population has more than tripled. And 60 years ago, there were problems of mass starvation around the world. Starvation was a reality worldwide. We see little in the way of starvation on a global or regional basis today. Aren't we faced then with a classic utilitarian trade-off? Bad things happen with glyphosate. Bad things happen without glyphosate. Would you care to comment on that? But before that, we'll go to Daniel. Daniel, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. My time here says it's afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, if I get your question correctly, the crux of our discussion is actually to appraise the digital innovations in agriculture and to appraise them. And what we do here, or what we maintain here, is that these are good innovations we have identified in our paper, and these are upcoming innovations that would increase food access to the growing population, increasing rural livelihoods and economic stability. As much as these innovations are good and sustainable for an increasing population like ours, especially in our own situation here in Nigeria, we are of the view that workers who have been controlled by AI and other technologies do not have their rights being protected. In other words, what we're saying is that there are no legal frameworks to cater for the new innovations. No legal framework. So our paper proposes that there should be legal frameworks that will cater for the new innovations so as to be able to protect the right of workers to have transparency, stronger labor inspections, better laws, and all what we have. Because if these things continue the way they are, as good as they appear, we are having job insecurity, unfair treatment of workers, and even increased inequality. So if I actually got your question very well, that's my view.
Well, thank you. And Dr. Booz, please.
3 parts to my answer. First of all, excellent question, because there is the reality of the green revolution. We are feeding more people than we've ever fed before. Yield rates are unbelievable. When I was a young man growing up on our farm, if we got 60 bushels of corn per acre, we were ecstatic. Now with these biotech seeds and with the glyphosate, we're getting 150 bushels. So it is more than doubled. So yes, there is an efficiency that is irrefutable. The question then becomes, Is it simply because of the pesticides and the genetically modified organisms? And if it is, we have to look at the nutritional value of the grain that is being produced. Because glyphosate is a chelator, that means that the product of what is produced, the seed, actually has less nutrition in it. It's missing the niacin, the iron, the thiamine, the copper, the zinc. Those seeds are there, and they're big, and they're better than we've ever had in terms of the amount, but are they effective? So that is a question that we have to look at. Second part of the answer is Denmark. Look at Denmark and its agricultural system. They're outproducing anyone in the world, and they're doing it without the pesticides. They have a model of biodynamics that is really should be duplicated worldwide. To accomplish that, we need to encourage more people to get back into agriculture on a smaller scale. Third part is we can, with technology, replace pesticides because we now have solar-powered drones. They charge during the day in the sunlight, and at night you put the drones into the fields, and they can eliminate weeds with no pesticides. We don't need the pesticides anymore. But the stranglehold that the pesticide corporations have on the thinking is what needs to change. And that's why, again, conferences like this are really important, and people need to know what the realities of these chemicals are. Do they up the efficiencies of agriculture, and do they produce more grain than ever before? Yes, that's indisputable, but at what cost? We have to look at the negative externalities of these chemicals and see that we are locking people into a petrochemical debt cycle, especially in the developing country, and that these are pernicious chemicals that do have negative side effects for humans. Can we do better? And I would say, yes, we can do better. We need to look at Denmark. We need to reinvent ourselves as a nation in terms of our agriculture, and we've got to do it in a heck of a hurry because glyphosate is not safe for humans.
And I would just add, Dr. Booz, if you could, you made some great points just in these remarks, and I'd suggest incorporating some of those points, particularly in the loss of nutritional value, into the final version of your paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the feedback. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for our first panel. Unfortunately, we do not have time for audience questions. However, now we will introduce our second panel.
Our second panel of the day examines contemporary agricultural issues in the United States. Our first speaker, Christina Hubbard, is the Outreach Program Manager for Dawson Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison College of Agricultural and Life Sciences, and the Director of Advocacy and Communications for Organic Seed Alliance, OSA, where she leads efforts to promote policies and actions that support organic seed systems, including managing OSA's State of Organic Seed Project. A recipient of the Doris Duke Conservation Fellowship, Hubbard has spent over 15 years drawing public attention to the concentration of economic and political power among the few corporations that control seed, biotechnology, and chemical inputs, the most concentrated sector in agriculture today. Throughout her career, Hubbard has led numerous farmer-based organization efforts, including one that ultimately prompted a federal antitrust investigation into the Monsanto company. At OSA, she furthers this work by advocating for sound public policy to protect farmers from the abuse of intellectual property rights by major seed corporations. Hubbard also leads OSA's initiatives to advance plant breeding and seed systems that meet the needs of the growing organic sector, complementing on-the-ground farmer training with persistent advocacy to improve seed standards and increase federal research funding for organics. Our second speaker in this panel is Robert Kahn, a professor here at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. He teaches and writes in the areas of legal writing, constitutional law, and comparative approaches to hate speech and historical memory. He earned his JD from New York University School of Law and his PhD in political science from Johns Hopkins University following undergraduate studies at Columbia University. Professor Kahn is the author of Holocaust Denial in Law, a comparative study, and numerous articles examining issues such as Holocaust denial, memory laws, burqa bans, and the regulation of extremist speech across different legal systems. His work, published widely in law reviews and on SSRN, brings a comparative and interdisciplinary perspective to questions at the intersection of free expression, equality, and collective memory. Please join me in welcoming our second panel.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. My name is Christina Hubbard. I go by Kiki, and I work currently as a researcher at the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I actually no longer work for Organic Seed Alliance, as was part of my bio, and for the last 3 years have worked with a small team at UW-Madison, where we have been researching and analyzing how the intellectual property system for seeds affects market competition in the industry. And to do this, we've been looking at how the policy domains of patents, antitrust, and licensing interact and ultimately impact the diversity of seed available to farmers. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about our work to understand the seed licensing agreements that farmers sign when purchasing their commodity crop seed. These licenses largely govern crop seeds such as corn, soybeans, and cotton, so major acreage crops. These licenses are known as technology agreements, and in agriculture today, signing a licensing agreement, whether you're a farmer or a small independent seed business or even a public university researcher, has essentially become a prerequisite for operating in the commodity seed trade. Our research methods have included analyzing licenses directly, interviewing small seed companies, as well as reviewing government-solicited public comments on these topics, including intellectual property rights on seeds and market consolidation concerns. Before jumping into our current research on technology agreements, I want to quickly share some context for this research. I'm going to quickly cover the intellectual property framework for seeds and talk a bit about market consolidation today and what that looks like, before getting into our research on the technology agreements. And I'll end today by sharing a few updates on what states have done to address some of these contract provisions that farmers sign. So again, let's begin with a quick overview of the intellectual property framework for seed. There are 2 federal statutes that give ownership rights to new plant varieties, to developers of new plant varieties. The first is the Plant Patent Act of 1930, and the second is the Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970. Now, the Plant Patent Act protects asexually reproduced plants only. So think clonally propagated plants, such as fruit trees that are propagated by grafting. This carve out for plants in the Patent Act excludes seeds, which means it largely excludes most of the food that we rely on to feed ourselves. And Congress was very intentional about making the Plant Patent Act to govern asexually reproducing plants only. Now, eventually Congress did pass a statute that allowed plant breeders to receive an IP protection for plant varieties that are sexually reproduced and that aren't covered by the Plant Patent Act. And this came in the form of the 1970 Plant Variety Protection Act. This act provides a patent-like protection for plant developers by giving them exclusive marketing rights on their varieties for 20 years. But these PVP certificates, as they're called, are not patents. They are actually administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and not the Patent and Trademark Office. And importantly, when Congress developed this statute, they acknowledged the tension between the privatization of seeds and farmers' time-honored practice of saving seed from their harvest year to year. And they acknowledged this tension by including a few very important exemptions in the law. They included exemptions for plant breeding, research, and seed saving. So under the Plant Variety Protection Act, farmers can save a portion of their seed to replant on their own farm, and breeders can use PVP protected varieties to cross them with other varieties in order to further innovation and develop new and improved crop varieties. I don't have time to cover the cases that are listed here on the timeline that you're looking at, but ultimately it was the courts that extended the reach of the utility patent system to include self-replicating organisms, including plant varieties and plant parts, such as genetic traits. Unlike the plant variety protection system that's operated by the USDA, again, patents on plants and genetic traits are commonly enforced to restrict research in plant breeding as well as seed saving. So an important takeaway here is that plants are subject to multiple forms of IP protections, and this adds tremendous complexity for even the most experienced plant developers and seed companies in the industry. Furthermore, we see on this timeline that the seed intellectual property system has evolved from one that largely recognized research, breeding, and seed saving as important practices to preserve to a system where these practices are now increasingly restrictive. And as I'll explain in this presentation, contracts play a significant role in enforcing these restrictions. Now, during the same time period that the IP system was evolving for plants, biotechnology companies were achieving enormous success in developing novel genetically engineered traits in corn, soybeans, and cotton. Genetically engineered crops entered the market in 1996, and they were wildly popular. You can see by this chart just how rapidly they were adopted. The first and most popular trait was an herbicide-tolerant trait called Roundup Ready, which allows crops to survive applications of Roundup or other glyphosate herbicides. And we've heard a lot about glyphosate herbicides already this morning. It's no surprise that the seed developers also sold the chemicals used in conjunction with these traits. Again, looking at this chart, you see that these traits were planted to the majority of crop acreage within a decade of their introduction. And with court decisions now affirming at this time the legality of patents on seeds, trait developers were able to secure this limited monopoly on their technology, and they enforced licensing agreements that restricted, again, research, plant breeding, and seed saving. Now, by restricting seed saving, these companies remove an important form of competition, which is their own customer base. And at first, trait developers licensed their traits pretty broadly to other companies before switching to a market strategy of buying up smaller companies that specialized in developing their own regionally adapted varieties for farmers that they served. So through dozens of acquisitions, the trait firms effectively were able to combine ownership of not only their genetically engineered traits, but they were able to seize ownership truly of the germplasm or the finished varieties that were necessary for distributing those traits to the farmers. Each acre represented here on this graph is planted to one or more genetically engineered traits. And each trait is tied to what is called a technology fee. You could also refer to it as a royalty that is then passed on to the farmer. This technology fee can represent up to 70% of the cost of a bag of corn seed. So it's no surprise that the price of seeds that include these proprietary traits has increased by 460% since the technology was introduced. For perspective, the prices that farmers receive for the crops they're growing, their grain, only increased by 56% during the same time period between 1990 and 2020. The expansion of more restrictive intellectual property rights on seeds and the rapid adoption of genetically engineered crops, as you just saw, were major drivers of consolidation in the industry. This consolidation is well documented by my colleague Phil Howard at Michigan State University. He developed this diagram that you're looking at, where you can see that the red circles represent chemical companies that now own much of the global seed supply. The most recent and largest mergers took place between 2016 and 2018. So during this 2-year time period alone, the 6 largest firms combined to create the 4 largest firms. And in particular, 3 major mergers took place during this 2-year period. Bayer purchased Monsanto, Dow DuPont merged and created an agricultural science spinoff called Corteva, and ChemChina purchased the Swiss-based company Syngenta. Hundreds of subsidiaries are now owned by a handful of transnational chemical companies, most of which are not based in the United States. For example, among the 4 largest firms, only one, Corteva, is headquartered here in the United States. And these 4 firms control more than 60% of the commercial global seed supply. They're integrated both vertically through the ownership of genetic traits, the germplasm, and seed treatments. They're also integrated horizontally, where these companies also own the seeds, the pesticide platforms used in conjunction with them, and increasingly farm machinery software programs. The concentration of IP ownership happened alongside concentration of power in the retail market. As I mentioned, the ability to own IP on much of the seed supply incentivized these mergers and acquisitions. And it's especially instructive to look at concentration in particular crop types. So for example, the concentration ratio of the top two firms in cotton, Bayer and Americot, the top two firms control more than 60% of this market for cottonseed. In corn and soybeans, Bayer and Corteva control more than 70% of the market in corn and more than 60% in soybeans. And it's no surprise that the three firms leading in retail sales also own the most patents on these genetics as well, with Bayer, Corteva, and Syngenta, the concentration ratio of the top three, owning 95% of all patents ever awarded for corn. Contracts are the most prominent tool for managing and enforcing all of these IP rights. As I mentioned before, our team has been analyzing these contracts, and in particular, we've been analyzing three types of contracts that show up in the seed industry and their effects on market competition and innovation. First, farmers typically sign a license when buying their seed, which, as I mentioned before, is called a technology agreement. They actually never own the seed they grow, but sign a limited use license to grow a single crop from that seed. These agreements, again, are the focus of the balance of my presentation, so I'll say more about these in a minute, but I just want to touch on the other two contract examples to give you further context, where the second type of contracts, known as a bag tag licensed agreement, appears as a shrink wrap contract on the actual packaging of a seed packet or a bag of seed. And growers are bound to the terms of this license simply by opening that package of seed. Third, independent seed companies sign a license to access finished varieties as well as the genetically engineered traits to then produce and sell under their own regional brands. So these smaller seed companies typically don't have a large research and development budget in order to host their own breeding programs and develop their own varieties. So they rely on these licenses with the dominant firms to access the most market essential varieties and traits. And these licensing agreements, which are very confidential, they're not public at all, are also typically coupled with loyalty rebate arrangements, which we are told usually show up as verbal arrangements and are not accompanied by a paper trail. One thing I want to note about all three types of contracts that you see here, the technology agreement, the bag tags, the seed company contracts, is that they're very similar across the dominant firms, especially the dominant two firms in corn and soybeans. So farmers and small seed companies cannot shop around for different contract terms because no real alternatives exist. So back to the farmer technology agreements. These licenses entered the marketplace with the introduction of Monsanto's Roundup Ready soybeans. Again, the first genetically engineered commodity crop trait to enter the market. In 1996, a farmer buying Roundup Ready soybeans signed a relatively short license that essentially said one thing: don't save the seed. Don't save and replant your seed. Don't share that seed. Don't sell it to your neighbor. And that was the deal. And for most farmers, this restriction didn't fully register, or if it did, it didn't seem real. Because saving seed for some crops, including soybeans, is not so much a policy position for farmers, it's just part of farming. And for thousands of years, a grower's harvest contained seeds to plant the next year. And so in this way, the seed was really part of what the land produced. It belonged in some fundamental sense to the person who grew it. The idea that a company could now own what came out of the ground and that replanting it could constitute patent infringement was difficult for a lot of growers to fathom. And so in the early years of these technologies and the technology agreements, farmers did what they always had. They saved their seed, and Monsanto sued them for it. There have been hundreds of investigations into farmers' alleged patent infringement or contract violations, and more than 130 of these cases have actually gone to court. The legal outcomes have largely been in Monsanto's favor, and the decisions have been consistent where the patents have held up in court, as have the contracts. For example, in 2013, the Supreme Court affirmed in Bowman versus Monsanto that a farmer who planted safe seed had infringed Monsanto's patent. And the court held that the doctrine of patent exhaustion does not allow a producer to, a grower to reproduce patents by replanting it or making new copies of the protected seeds. And the effect of these court decisions and really the effect of these licenses has not just been legal, it's been cultural, because the relationship between farmers and their seeds has essentially been severed and replaced by a licensing arrangement, and has recast farmers as end-use licensees. The seed is no longer theirs to keep or use, or use how they see fit, because they never own it. As the industry consolidated and Monsanto's market shares continue to grow, we have found that the licenses have grown alongside this growth in market power, both in length as well as restrictiveness. As you saw in Phil Howard's diagram earlier, a small number of these chemical companies have acquired dozens of regional seeds companies, which has consolidated the ownership of trait patents, plant varieties, as well as distribution networks. And this transition toward more restrictive licensing agreements, again, as we've found in our research, has really shaped and in turn been reinforced by this major restructuring in the global seed industry. We saw that consolidation really peaked in 2018 when Bayer again purchased Monsanto for $63 billion, which represented the largest transaction in the history of the seed industry. Today, 30 years since the introduction of the first technology agreement, these licensing agreements between farmers and their seed supplier have grown into something else entirely. The technology agreement really represents now a multi-document framework that includes mandatory disclosure of personal data, class action waivers, warranty disclaimers, and much more. I say multi-document framework because the technology agreement also binds growers to a lengthier document that can be 75 pages or more, called a technology use guide. So this technology use guide outlines for farmers what is required of them when using, in this case, Bayer's genetically engineered seed products, including expected best practices, as well as legal requirements. So what does the fine print say? First of all, restrictions on saving, sharing, and selling seed, as well as restrictions on research and plant breeding, are still the core restrictions that these contracts aim to enforce. But again, the conditions have evolved to require so much more of farmers. For starters, when a farmer signs a technology agreement, they're essentially giving up a number of privacy and property rights through the mandated disclosure of production data. By signing the license, growers agree to turn over not only access to their records and receipts, as well as records and receipts with other input suppliers, by the way, but they also agree to turn over data that they submit to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Farm Service Agency, as well as any aerial photographs, maps if they're available, as well as access to their physical land and crops and storage containers. The technology agreement also allows the company to obtain a grower's internet or cell phone service provider record to validate a licensee's signature on the contract. You can see already that what began as a narrow right to investigate suspicions of seed saving quickly became a standing audit power over the whole farm operation. And remember that these are standard form contracts that are take it or leave it licenses where over 90% of commercial corn, soybean, and cotton acres carry one or more of these licensed traits or varieties. And all of these traits and varieties are essentially governed by the same contract. In addition to surrendering personal data to the company, the licenses also establish that any dispute related to the contract must be filed in a courthouse in St. Louis, Missouri, which is the U.S. headquarters of Bayer, where Monsanto was originally established and is still headquartered today. This puts growers who live outside of Missouri at a great disadvantage should they, for example, be investigated or accused of patent infringement, or for violating the contract in other ways, or if a grower wants to seek remedies from the company for product performance. Following Bayer's purchase of Monsanto, it's worth noting that the technology agreement was then updated to include a class action waiver. So they removed the opportunity for growers who licensed from them to join a group lawsuit against the company. This class action waiver is actually a good example of the company's right, as is written in the contract, to make unilateral changes to the contract simply by notifying the licensee of these changes, whether through email or even text. In the case of the class action waiver addendum, farmers learned of this change to the license in March of 2024 via an email. Since it was March, this is after most farmers had purchased their seed for the year and after they had already signed the license. In other words, there really is no meaningful consent in this process, especially when it comes to changes to the licenses that, again, are made unilaterally by the licensor. I want to mention, too, that in important ways, these licenses are evergreen, meaning growers are bound to the terms of the license for as long as they are using the company's products, whether they sign a new license each year or not. I want to turn our attention briefly to the warranty language in these licensing agreements as well. Before 2001, there wasn't a product warranty listed in the license at all. Then in 2001, the limited warranty appeared, saying that the technologies would perform as described in the technology agreement, as well as how they're described in the technology use guide. But the warranty soon contracted. It is now voided entirely if a farmer uses what the company calls unauthorized seed treatments or herbicides. So that means if a grower wants to use a generic form of Roundup, so a glyphosate herbicide produced by a competitor on their Roundup Ready crops, and that the seed doesn't perform as stated, there is no warranty available to them because they used a competitor's generic product, as one example. And of course, the trademark herbicides are typically more expensive. By 2024, the disclaimer had been expanded to cover crop performance more generally, ensuring that the seed was free from crop diseases, which is a very typical quality control measure that seed companies or that growers rely on from the seed manufacturers they purchase from, as well as unintentional genetically engineered traits that might appear or be contained in the seed farmers are purchasing. So clear that these disclaimers are providing the company tremendous immunity from potential liability. And what we see is a trend where the warranty has been shrinking in scope, but the disclaimers have only grown. Another trend we've documented is reduced transparency in both the price associated with the seed technology growers are using, as well as the intellectual property rights. When these traits were first introduced, farmers paid a separate technology fee when purchasing a bag of seed. So they could actually see on paper what they were paying for this new technology. By 2005, the fee had been folded into the seed purchase price, so farmers didn't know how much they were paying for the variety versus the genetically engineered trait. And by 2020, this language in the license in particular became even broader and more difficult to parse out, as farmers were now agreeing to pay all applicable royalties and technology fees without having access to what those fees were. In other words, the obligation to pay these fees didn't go away, they just became harder to see, even as the price of seed, as I mentioned earlier, continued to skyrocket. It's also difficult for farmers to know what, if any, intellectual property protections are associated with the seed they're planting. When technology agreements came out in 1996, they actually listed all the patent numbers on the bottom of the contract. You can actually see an image here on my slide of the patents listed on one of the earlier technology agreements. Now, growers are simply directed to the company's website in order to navigate their web pages to identify the intellectual property rights that may be associated with the seed they're purchasing. And for some licenses, such as the one used by the Syngenta company, many patents listed are actually expired which can be misleading for seed companies that are tracking the expiration of patents in order to use those expired traits or varieties to develop new varieties or further innovation in that way. And we also believe that printing patents that have expired on licenses or even seed packaging could potentially have a chilling effect on research, since most researchers, especially those in the public university sector, assume that patents listed are active, and they don't typically have access to a robust legal team, including patent attorneys who can help them investigate or examine, rather, individual patents. So there are a number of other contract provisions in these agreements that I don't have time to unpack with you here today. Our team continues to analyze data across 20 agreements that we've been able to track down. And as we write up our findings, we can say with confidence that these agreements have undergone systematic and deliberate expansions of corporate rights while restricting farmer autonomy, and that this transformation in licensing terms has been driven by and really reinforced by consolidation of market power in the seed industry. What began as a notice of patent rights has become a lengthy license and legal framework that governs millions of American farmers. These are licenses that are written by one party, revised by one party, and enforced by one party. And I'll end by just sharing that some states have started to push back, if only a little bit, by passing laws that, for example, void forum selection clause to ensure that disputes are resolved in the state where the farmer resides if they've entered into one of these licensing agreements. Some of these laws establish protocols for licensors when conducting patent infringement investigations. So in other words, some states require that a patent holder has to get the permission of a farmer before accessing their land and crops for samples. Farmers have the right to engage a third party, such as their state Department of Agriculture, in participating in the investigation and taking duplicate samples using an independent lab. And some of these laws even go further to protect growers from unintended patent infringement. So by shielding farmers from liability, if a patented genetically engineered trait shows up in their crop that isn't genetically engineered and are found at de minimis levels, and if there's proof that the farmer acted in good faith, these laws aim to shield those growers from patent infringement liability. While you're waiting for our article to be completed, you can check out this resource that we collaborated on with our friends at Vermont Law School. This is a resource that was developed for farmers to help them unpack the fine print of these technology agreements, and it was just published last year. And with that, I'll wrap up and say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Dr. Hubbard, thank you so much for your presentation. I believe we'll go to Professor Khan first, and then I have questions both for you and for Professor Khan at the end of the panel. Is that all right?
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. This is a paper about industrial agriculture, state power, and protest. My thesis is that in a late capitalist society dominated by agribusiness, some protest is favored over others. And you can either view this as an iceberg of protest that is high profile and adored in some respect versus protest activities that are underneath the iceberg. Or you can think about it as Wilbur and the Lorax. Above ground, you have animal rescue activities at Smithfield Farms, another multinational corporation. And in particular, I'm thinking of the 2022 case in which two underfed pigs were rescued and given the names of Lily and Lizzie, and were acquitted, not the pigs, but the rescuers, by a Utah jury. And, this was a wonderful thing, Some of the jurors joined the animal rights movement, saved Wilbur. Wilbur's a very good pig, but there are lots of other pigs in Smithfield Farms that haven't been saved. By contrast, below the iceberg is the world of the Lorax, and there was an article in Perspectives of Terrorism, a Dutch journal, that came out in 2025 about, wait, there is terrorism in the Lorax, examining portrayals of ecotage and eco-terrorism in influential fiction film. The Lorax, from the 1971 Dr. Seuss book and the 2012 film, is a speaker, someone who speaks about efforts to despoil the environment. In the Lorax, for our purposes, speaks to a triad of laws that curb protest activities that strike more deeply at the basis of industrialized agriculture. These are agricultural libel laws that punish saying insulting things about livestock or a product, a fruit, a seed. Whistleblower laws, the second category, that punish filming or entering into a farm and lying about your resume, on your resume to enter the farm. And the third category are anti-terror laws. And we'll talk about all three of them in a minute. And my interest is in how this divide between what seems to be an acceptable space of protest around animal rescue leads to contradictions and leads to a legal theory, which voluntary prosecution, which I'll describe in a minute, that doesn't seem to apply on the other side of the iceberg. So let me talk about voluntary prosecution. And this comes from a 2025 Harvard Law Review forum article by Justin Marceau, Wayne Hsing, and Stefan Seitz. Wayne Hsing was one of the defendants who represented himself in the Smithfield Farms trial. And this is an idea of creative lawyering and movement building. The idea being that when you are faced with a prosecution, for rescuing an animal, you ought to embrace the prosecution. This is a form of legal jujitsu. You make the state regret that they ever prosecuted you. And there's a sense in which certainly this happened with the Smithfield trial in Utah, where Hsing and Paul Darwin Picklesimmer entered the farm, removed the two pigs, Lily and Lizzie, made a video, which then led to a reaction by the state. Before the trial even began, the FBI sought to locate Lily and Lizzie, went to a farm, identified the wrong pigs, tried to cut the ear of one of the pigs, and the pig squealed so loudly that they didn't go for the other pig. Negative publicity. At the trial itself, the defendants made the argument that Lily and Lizzie had no value, therefore taking them couldn't be theft. And in fact, they were kind of like an underwater mortgage in that it would cost more money for the veterinarians to fix Lily and Lizzie to make them saleable than their value would be once they were fixed. There were juror interviews afterwards, and one of the hurdles that the jurors faced was saying that the pig had no value meant saying that the pig had no soul, which just leave that as an aside. The state did exactly what voluntary prosecution would think, and prosecutors said, well, a dented can has, no value. I mean, still has value, and the pig is just like a dented can. That did not win over the jury, and in fact, in the jury interviews afterwards, one juror, there were 6 of them, stopped eating meat. Another one started to write letters in support of the animal rights movement. A third one, while still eating meat, thought twice the next time they had, pork or bacon or whatever it is. And the authors wrap this into a larger theory of voluntary prosecution with figures like Rosa Parks and Susan B. Anthony, who voted illegally in the 1872 presidential election when women weren't able to vote. This isn't civil disobedience because the focus isn't on the disobedient act, although Rosa Parks sitting in the front of the bus had that quality. The idea is you're looking ahead to the trial, and you're looking at the trial as being an opportunity to highlight some of the weaknesses of the system. It's also not, for what lack of a better word is, a focus on jury nullification or getting out on a technicality. It's not that once Picklesimmer and Hsing are, in front of the jury, they just want it to go away. No, they actually want to put on a case and convince people. The authors view this as a viable element of progressive social movements, necessary, desirable, and for long-term change. And I don't want to necessarily say this is a bad thing, but let's go below the iceberg for a second and talk about how these strategies would work in the context of, say, agricultural libel laws. And these laws punish defamatory statements, often about the safety of agricultural produce. One of the most famous cases involved Oprah Winfrey. This was in 1996. She had a segment about mad cow disease. She actually, followed at least the spirit of the fairness doctrine and had experts on both sides. On the other side of the commercial break, Oprah said, "Wow, that stopped me cold from eating another burger." Texas sued under its agricultural disparagement law. Eventually, a jury acquitted, but not before Oprah spent between $500,000 and $1 million and went through what she described at the time as the worst experience of her life. Take another example from South Dakota in 2012. There was an expert who referred to filler added to agricultural products as pink slime. The result was a 257-page complaint filed against ABC with treble damages. It came up to $1.2 billion of liability, and ABC settled for $177 million. And my question, and I guess I'll repeat it a couple of times, is this a situation where, Oprah or ABC have embraced the litigation? Let's talk a little bit about traditional whistleblowing laws. They punish entering a farm and recording without permission. Many jurisdictions have found these laws unconstitutional, but interestingly enough, not the Eighth Circuit, which is where Monsanto is headquartered. Iowa's law, which was the subject of the most recent case, or one of them, treats trespassing and filming on agricultural property as an aggravated misdemeanor, punishable by 2 years in jail and a $8,500 fine. A regular misdemeanor is 30 days. Finally, we have anti-terror laws, and there are two varieties of these: the Animal Enterprise Protection Act of 1992 and then the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act of 2006. The AETA basically expanded the AEPA. What they do is they punish either physical disruption of a animal enterprise, or under the 2006 Act, merely interference and economic damages. And these rules can be combined with conspiracy law to create a fairly powerful combination, as occurred in U.S. v. Fulmer. Fulmer involved activists opposed to animal testing at the Huntington labs. They had a group called Stop Huntington, New Jersey. They weren't charged under the act. They were charged with conspiracy to violate the act. The website the group ran had news of illegal acts, engaged in some doxing, allegedly coordinated, and had a list of 20 top terror tactics, all of which was conceitedly, I mean, maybe the doxing would be slightly different, as protected First Amendment activity. What the defendants were actually convicted of were giving speeches in favor of some of the acts. And to be fair, and to just give a little background, the protests worked by having people who worked with Huntington, doctors, law firms, accounting firms, they were doxxed, they were protested. A stink bomb was thrown at one point. I'm not saying this is wonderful activity, but the defendants were found guilty of conspiracy for speaking in favor of this, for relying on encryption software, or one person got in trouble for saying, something big is going on, we can't talk on the phone about this, which suggested, involvement. This led to 3 to 6 years of prison for the 6 defendants. And my question is whether voluntary prosecution, the idea of embracing the state's power, works for them. I have a contrast here of worthy versus unworthy protesting built on the idea of worthy and unworthy poor in Elizabethan England, where the worthy poor are able to get alms and the unworthy poor aren't. This focuses attention on the state while directing behavior. So you can steal a pig, you can name it, and maybe you're okay. And, you might wind up with, charges for theft that don't have great penalties. On the other hand, disparaging agricultural products, in industrial farms like Smithfield, trespassing and filming, or exercising sympathy by supporting is met with draconian civil litigation and criminal prosecutions. And I'd just like to say, I'll probably build on this in the paper, it makes me think a little bit about India and cow protection, where the animals that are protected in India actually reflect the caste system, so that a cow associated with the Brahmins is protected in many ways. A water buffalo associated with the Dalit isn't. So this brings me to 3 particular concerns I have about the voluntary prosecution idea. The first one is it reinforces the idea of the carceral state. The second is that it isn't available on the other side of the iceberg. And the third thing is the authors have a very limited view of the political, where the only people who are activists are progressives. So let me take up each of these one at a time. To be fair, the authors do mention that being charged with a crime can be life-altering. They mention the new Jim Crow. At the same time, they can't help themselves to talk about, how much Americans like crime, like true crime. Criminal law is an American civil religion. There's an insatiable interest in stories of malfeasance. My question here is, what if, this aspect of American society isn't a feature, but is actually a bug? And does using the carceral state reinforce it? After the Smithfield acquittals, there were calls for harsher laws. And I wonder about the prosecutor, who was made a fool across the country for calling the pig a dented can. How does the prosecutor act the very next time the prosecutor is, prosecuting a case, maybe for, disorderly conduct or just a rank and file case? Second thing in this question, I'm not sure I totally agree, or I see an issue with downplaying technicalities. Sometimes it's good to get off in a technicality. And to the extent what voluntary prosecution is saying is, let's have a show trial. Let's have this high profile trial favored by the defendant. Can't the state turn around and do that? And doesn't the state do that all the time when they say, we're prosecuting you to make an example of you? So I just have some concerns with the state, with the carceral state. Second issue is availability of this. So rescue is easy. It's not perfectly easy, and I don't want to diminish the bravery of what Pickle Simmer and Singh are doing, but you can argue an abused animal has no value. The necessity defense, which also comes up here, is harder. The question there is whether the animal is sick. And there have been litigation in cases involving animal rescue that, turn on this. When you get to trespassing and filming and lying on your resume, you're no longer having questions about animals, at least so long as you're not doing necessity. You're saying, did you enter? Did you film? It's much harder to make a conversation about that. And when you get to conspiracy, the wheels fall off altogether. And to show this, let me switch to another example. This comes from an article that Stefan Seitz, one of the authors, published last year on conspiracy. So assume there are students on the quad protesting something. Maybe it's apartheid, maybe it's the Gaza war, whatever it is. And A, B, and C are protesting. X is a friend of them. X is sympathetic to the cause. Maybe we don't know. But X likes A, B, and C, and she decides I'm going to bring lunch. I'm going to go bring lunch to the people occupying the quad. I'm going to go there. I'm going to bring the lunch. I'm going to leave. Arguably, she's guilty of conspiracy to trespass, which all of a sudden has a lengthy prison sentence. And when the state uses its behavior that way, and to be honest, they did, not the state, but Columbia University did in the 2024 protests at Hamilton Hall, when everyone in the building was alleged to be in a conspiracy to harm the janitor who was injured during the building occupation. In this situation, do you want to embrace the prosecution, or do you just want to say that punishing conspiracy in this way is a gross abuse of state power? All right, third point. So voluntary prosecution assumes the underlying politics are, quote, good or progressive. And let's say that Rosa Parks and Susan B. Anthony are easy cases. But are cases always that easy? Take a complicated issue, maybe an issue about war and peace, maybe an issue about personal privacy, where people of good minds might disagree. What counts as progressive? Second thing is, why can't the so-called baddies also use the trial in this way? And I would argue that they have. As was mentioned in my intro, part of my work is on Holocaust denial, and my dissertation looked at the case of Ernst Zundel. Ernst Zundel was an interesting guy. He was a German immigrant to Canada. In the early 80s, he was sending Holocaust denial materials to neo-Nazis in then West Germany. The Canadians tried to revoke his mailing privileges. That failed. A group of Holocaust survivors, supported eventually by the Ontario Attorney General, sued Zundel under the false news law, which comes from 13th century England. It punishes news disseminated when the speaker knew it was false. Now, at this point, Zundel could have said, this violates my freedom of speech, and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association was willing to represent him. Instead, Zundel embraced the trial. At his first prosecution, he cross-examined Holocaust survivors, questioned Holocaust experts like Rau Hilberg, invited his own experts like Robert Farris-Sahn, sought to introduce a scale map of Auschwitz into evidence. Meanwhile, this was being, published and written about by crime reporters in the Toronto media as if this was breaking news. Zundel was twice convicted. There were procedural irregularities in his first trial. And eventually, in 1992, the Canadian Supreme Court tossed out the fake news law as violating freedom of speech, but Zundel claimed he received $6 million of free publicity. My question is, how is, from a procedural perspective, what Zundel did different from what Darwin and Picklesimmer did? And this raises larger questions about politics and state power. When you throw the book at Donald Trump or the January 6th protesters, seems great, but then Trump takes over and the same book, with a few different pages is thrown, at ICE protesters who are labeled as domestic terrorists. And let me just take one other example that seems a little different, but I want to bring it back to agricultural protest. In 2025, the Second Circuit threw out conspiracy charges against Douglas Mackey. Mackey was a troll who texted Hillary Clinton voters or put up text direct labeling them that they could vote by text. He did wear a MAGA cap and often had a MAGA hashtag. And there's a question about whether they were misleading and about whether the underlying crimes should be punished. But Mackey was charged under 18 USC 241, which requires a conspiracy to, emphasis on conspiracy, deprive someone of their civil rights. And he was charged, convicted, sentenced to jail without much thought about the conspiracy. On appeal, this became an issue. And Mackey was a member of a direct messaging group, the War Room, which had similar texts, but often without the MAGA hashtags. There was no proof that Mackey ever saw those texts. There is no proof that Mackey ever monitored that information. The theory instead was that there was a silent conspiracy. So if you're in a direct message group, you're doing something roughly similar. You're guilty of what other members of the group did. And here go back to the Huntington Six, who had the website and protested against what Huntington did. If you were in a Reddit group or a Facebook group or a direct message group at that time, what's to prevent you from being charged with conspiracy there? And what's, frustrating to me is many of the same progressives who were so excited, about social movements and all that, actually supported the prosecution of Mackey up and through the litigation with the Second Circuit. To give, a second example of this, there was an article published in the Houston Law Review by a student. And again, I don't want to pick on the student that much, but the gist of the argument was, let's punish white supremacists by adopting the same theories that are behind the Animal Enterprise Terrorist Act and the Fulmer case. And the student, again, very eager, I'm not taking a position opposing the student, when she describes Fulmer, describes it in a way that gives no interest, no respect at all to what the animal rights activists, might have been doing there. So let me, wrap up by saying two things. First thing is, protests take place in all political sides. And when you think about using the criminal law system, you want to think about a system that applies to everybody. Actually, 3 points. Second point is, thinking about the iceberg. Let's celebrate freeing the pigs, but Wilbur's survival doesn't stop the killing, nor will protecting Lily or Lizzie. Instead, we need to focus on questioning state power and opposing it in less glamorous settings, such as agricultural gag laws. And then finally, when I was thinking about Charlotte and the Lorax, I couldn't help but think about the King's Stilts, another, Dr. Seuss book from 1939. And the King's Stilts is about a kingdom that's surrounded by water. It's protected by dike trees. The dike trees are infested with lizards who find the dike fruit very tasty. Patrol cats keep the lizards in check. The king's main duty is to keep the patrol cats happy. And the king, for his well-being, depends on stilts. Lord Droon steals those stilts, which then leads to the king being depressed, the patrol cats not being fed, the lizards going crazy, the dike trees falling, and water coming in. And I think the king stilts, in some ways, is much more threatening to our agri-capitalist society than the Lorax is, because it shows the interconnectedness of the world in which we live. The second thing is the hero of the King Stilts is Eric the page boy, the good government official who, you know, is understands what Lord Droon has done. Lord Droon has taken the stilts away because they appeared undignified. I'll grant that doesn't fit into what I'm saying here, but Eric, who is a commoner, is able to find the stilts, rescue the society, the patrol cats are fed, the birds are put in check, the dike trees are back, and the water goes away. And it suggests that in some ways the strongest, most important issue to deal with, is regulatory capture. And, the messaging that you need is messaging that directs that. And to the extent, you know, freedom of speech, according to Justice Brandeis, is about letting the sunshine in. This is really a place where you need to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank both of this morning's panelists, and I have questions for each of them. And I'll begin with Dr. Hubbard. And I'll begin by noting a subsidiary point you made, and that's the cultural impact of agriculture. The United States, in many respects, was seen in its founding in the 19th century as an agrarian society. Agrarianism was supposed to be the backbone of the United States. Now, we've clearly moved away from those propositions, but I think it's still perhaps maybe deeply embedded within our political DNA, and something worth paying attention to. I really enjoyed your paper. I teach contract law, and I may well use your paper when it's published in our journal as a case study in the ways in which contract law can be abused, if you will, to create very one-sided arrangements. But let me ask a question, and that question is this. We have available to us, at least conceptually available to us, tools that could be utilized as a way of counteracting the trends you've identified. And one important tool that you've mentioned is the development of state laws governing the law of contracts. But let me ask also about federal legislation, especially as we deal with concentrated industries. Aren't we dealing with issues of antitrust? And antitrust, of course, has gone through many metamorphoses, but perhaps we need to reinvigorate our antitrust laws and apply our antitrust laws to some of the problems you've identified. And Professor Khan, if I might pose a question to you, and that is, I actually a set of observations more than a question, but I really, really, really enjoyed the story of the two pigs, but this brings out a question, an issue. Protest, especially when you go to trial, is always theatrical. It's always theatrical on both sides. And and I wrote down in my notes a juxtaposition. We have those classic trials in English legal history. William Penn, for example, comes to mind in the Quaker trials of the 17th century, and the ways in which they ridiculed and brought the state to shame. But at the same time, we have Michel Foucault and the story he tells in his book, Discipline and Punish. That's the state side of the story. Two very different aspects to the same story. I'd encourage you to give some thought to the two sides of protest as theater. But let me also just ask a question. When you bring up agricultural libel laws, the agricultural libel laws, of course, are a species of libel law. And do we need enhanced protection for criticism of food products? And I wrote in my notes, Sullivan versus New York Times. Can a hamburger be a public figure? Finally, terrorism. I mean, the terrorism is always, it's a rhetorical choice. And legislators and courts and public officials love to use the word terror. It's a means of social control. Terrorism is a means of exerting a special form of social control. Let me encourage you also, now that I'm making you do a lot of work if you take all this up, into developing that point also in your paper. Anyways, thank you both for your presentations, and I look forward to your responses, and thank you. Dr.
Thank you so much. I'll try to be quick. I'm recognizing the time. First of all, yes, we already have available to us some strong antitrust tools. Many scholars will agree that in the cases of some of the mergers that we've seen take place, especially the major mergers that happened between 2016 and 2018, they likely shouldn't have been allowed. But instead, our Department of Justice has too often relied on merger remedies. And in the case of Bayer purchasing Monsanto, for example, the Department of Justice required Bayer to divest a number of their portfolios in specific crop areas, but they were divested to the fourth largest seed company in the industry. And in so doing, I think it can be argued that you are essentially just reshuffling the top of the deck and further entrenching an existing oligopoly in the market. And so again, they have the tools to block potentially anti-competitive mergers. They also have the tools to prohibit agreements and business practices that unreasonably restrain trade and competition, including contracts. We do know that right now, the US Department of Justice is investigating market practices in the seed industry. I find that encouraging. I hope they're looking at licensing agreements and the loyalty rebate programs that independent small seed businesses, that farmers rely on to get the seed they need to be successful, that they're looking at and examining those licensing practices combined with the loyalty rebate programs. Of course, states have the authority to investigate anti-competitive conduct as well. We also have available to us the means to update patent law. Congress could update, for example, or clarify that the Plant Variety Protection Act, it was their intent for that to be the sole authority over sexually reproducing plant varieties. If you look at the congressional record, that was Congress's intent. It wasn't until Supreme Court decisions opened the door to the utility patenting of self-replicating organisms, including plant varieties. So there are a number of pathways forward when it comes to federal solutions, and those are just a few of them.
Thank you. Professor Kahn.
Thanks also for the comments. I really appreciate them. Let me say a brief thing about each of them. I take to heart the juxtaposition and that both sides can play political theater. I will say it's in defense of the authors. The defendant's failure to do theater doesn't mean that the prosecution will necessarily play nice. So I do think that, discipline and punish is always there. At the same time, I do think that, as has been the case of other social movements, the use of the word, I still worry that the use of theater in a certain way risks reinforcing the strength of the justice system as a whole. And part of my feeling is, we can play David and Goliath and have a fight over who's David and who's Goliath, or we can try to have a judicial system where there are neither of those people, and we try to, in a more less adversarial system, simply, mend fractures in society. I love the idea of, uh, New York Times v. Sullivan and a burger as a public figure. And I do think that we absolutely need additional protections in the animal, libel field. And one of the things about First Amendment case law, and you see it, with the 257-page complaint, is even if you are a public figure, lawfare is a real concern. Final point, I actually take the terrorism point to heart and to think about it in terms of, social control. And it's interesting to me that how early the Animal Enterprise Protection Act is and how early in the day people are willing to, how easy people are willing to call things, terrorists, because I think the word has a meaning we all understand at some point about certain, international actions. But terrorism is the use of force to influence policy, which is very, very broad and very elastic. And that's also a thing that, complicates animal rights activism. Thanks for the comments.
Thank you.
Back, everyone. For our today's keynote speaker, we have Chad Marzin. Chad Marzin is a professor of business law at the Seminole College of Business. He grew up on a farm in north central Iowa and is a proud first-generation undergraduate as well as law school graduate. He received a BA from Grinnell College in 2005 and a JD from St. Louis University in 2008. He practiced in an insurance defense law firm in Omaha, Nebraska, prior to serving 12 years on the faculty of College of Business at Florida State University. He's a member of the State Bar of Iowa. Marzin has served as an expert witness on 3 crop insurance cases in federal court and has presented on federal crop insurance issue at the Boston College Law School, Creighton University School of Law, and the University of North Dakota School of Law. He's a recipient of the Distinguished Scholar Award from CB Memorial Scholarship Association in 2013, the Ralph G. Bunchy Award from the Academy of Legal Studies in Business in 2014, the Professional Scholarship Award from the American Agricultural Law Association in 2019, the University Undergraduate Teaching Award from Florida State University in 2020, and the Charles G. Hardwick Undergraduate Teaching Award from the Florida State University College of Business. Let's welcome Chad Marzin.
Thank you very much for the kind and wonderful introduction, and many thanks once again to the University of St. Thomas School of Law for putting together this symposium on agriculture and food policy. It was a privilege to present at St. Thomas about 5 years ago for a symposium on the common good, and it's always wonderful to see the role of Catholic law schools in educating lawyers for the common good. And so it's a privilege to be here today. I definitely want to thank the University of St. Thomas. I want to thank everyone who put together the symposium. I want to thank the staff of the Journal of Law and Public Policy and everyone who was instrumental in putting together this symposium for today. Today, I'm going to be speaking on the potential for bipartisanship in the wake of times where there seems to be very little of bipartisanship. And that is in the realm of agricultural policy. And as I'll talk about today, I do think there is some cautious optimism despite all the partisanship in Washington. So I'm going to go through a number of potential areas of convergence where diverse coalitions may be able to form to promote the common good and promote producers and agriculture. So if we think about like partisanship today, we're kind of in the wake of multiple government shutdowns. As you can see on the slide, the long TSA lines, hopefully no one has had to go through those. But yeah, we have a time where there's very, very high partisanship in the United States. And what's very interesting is last month, Roll Call put together a study of congressional votes. And they concluded that 85.3% of roll call votes last year in Congress were party unity votes. Basically, those are votes with majority of each party facing off on opposite sides. And that's actually more than 10 percentage points higher than the previous record of 74.6% in 2023. So if we're looking at like the data from Congress, party line, party unity votes are at an all-time high. If we look at the public opinion surveys, the Gallup public opinion surveys in the past couple of years, indicate that partisanship is at an all-time high in terms of where we're at in the United States today. Is there a possible exception in agricultural policy? And that's kind of the focus of my article and the focus of this presentation today. I think there is some room for cautious optimism. I tend to be an optimistic thinker. I believe the common good will prevail in a lot of areas. So I think agricultural policy is one area where we might have an exception to the rule, like cautious optimism, but we shall see. I think a good example of this thus far in the first year of the second Trump term is a passage of the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act. Some other potential areas that I'm going to talk about briefly today where there may be convergences that arise in the next year or two, or the issue of crop insurance, the issue of wildfire risk management, and the Fix Our Forest Act, I think is a good example as well. I think there's definitely potential for dynamic convergence in the area of organic agriculture and the Make America Healthy Again movement, or MAHA movement. And then very interestingly enough, in the past month or two, a coalition of bipartisan legislators in opposition to the Trump administration in agricultural policy with the issue of glyphosate or Roundup. So I'm going to talk about each one of these issues in turn, but I want to start with the issue of whole milk. This photograph I actually took 5 days ago. Here in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of dairy farmers. And so I was on a trip to Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour from State College. And I had to stop by the side of the road to take this picture of this board. But drink whole milk. It's virtually 97% fat-free. So you see a number of these signs here in Pennsylvania. It's a very, very important issue for the dairy producers here. But the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act has kind of a long history in the past several years. If we look at the issue of childhood obesity, this has been an issue that certainly has been emphasized by those in public health. Interestingly enough, also emphasized by many advocates in the MAHA movement. But according to a CDC report, between 2021 and 2023, approximately 21.1% of Americans aged 2 to 19 were classified as obese. And this number is actually much, much higher than the 1970s. You look at some data from the 1970s, it's about a third of that percentage. With the issue of whole milk, traditionally it was thought that children should refrain from drinking whole milk as opposed to lower fat milk due to the higher saturated fat content in whole milk. And of course, there's a linkage that has been made between higher saturated fat levels and cholesterol risk by doctors. And so in 2010, the issue of like the whole milk for healthy kids, this goes back to 2010. And the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010, which the intent of that law passed 16 years ago was to reduce childhood obesity, reduce rates of obesity, and require schools participating in the National School Lunch Program to follow dietary guidelines for healthier foods. And so USDA regulations followed the enactment of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010. And those regulations basically required that for schools participating in the National School Lunch Program, and you have a vast majority of public schools in the United States that participate in the National School Lunch Program, these schools had to offer either fat-free or low-fat 1% milk. There have been more recent studies in recent years that kind of question this idea of whether or not whole milk is actually dangerous or more dangerous than it was maybe previously seen. So there are some studies out there that indicate that whole milk doesn't necessarily link the higher fat content of milk to metabolic health, decreases in that. And then in addition, there are nutritionists that do emphasize that, whole milk does contain vitamins A, D, E, and K, which are essential vitamins for healthy living, eye health, immunity, bone strength, and cellular function, for example. So we look back at some of these congressional efforts to bring back whole milk into the schools. And so the story of the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act is one of increasing momentum from term to term in Congress. In the 115th Congress, 8 years ago, there was a Whole Milk Act that was sponsored by Representative Tom Marino, Republican of Pennsylvania. And this would have amended the the 2010, the Healthy Hunger-Free Healthy Kids Act. This would have amended those regulations on whole milk to include unflavored whole milk. So this first piece of legislation was in 2018. What was interesting about this piece of legislation, it was limited to unflavored whole milk, and there were 13 co-sponsors that were all Republican. Fast forward about a year later, you have Congressman Glenn Thompson, who's actually chair of the House Agriculture Committee now. It's a name that many of you are probably familiar with. We'll probably see his name quite a bit over the next year with discussions of the Farm Bill. Glenn Thompson sponsored the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act, the more recent iteration in 2019 for the first time. And this bill would have allowed the serving of either flavored or unflavored whole milk. So it expanded whole milk categories that would be permissible. There were 43 co-sponsors of this bill, 31 Republicans and 12 Democrats. So you see some increasing momentum and some amendments to the bill. As we go forward in 2021, in the 117th Congress, we have 97 co-sponsors. There's 77 Republicans, 20 Democrats. This version of the legislation would have allowed schools to offer either whole, reduced fat, low fat, and fat-free flavored as well as unflavored milk. Fast forward another 2 years to the 118th Congress. In 2023, the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act was reintroduced again. In this particular term, there were 134 co-sponsors. So you have 107 Republicans and 27 Democrats. What's very interesting about this particular version of the bill is that in addition to the whole flavored and unflavored milk categories, the legislation also provided that the milk that would be allowed under the National School Lunch Program, if it was whole milk, could be either organic or non-organic milk. So that was a big change in 2023. Also interesting in 2023, there was a provision that was added in that would prohibit school districts to purchase or offer milk produced by any state-owned enterprise of the People's Republic of China. Now, this bill actually passed the House. In contrast to the prior iterations of the legislation, that the bill didn't make it out of committee. In the 118th Congress, the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act made it out of committee. It actually made it to a full debate on the floor of the House. It passed by a very large margin, but did not make it to the Senate. Most recently, in the past year, first year of the second Trump term, we have the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act, sponsored by Representative Thompson again, as well as Representative Kim Schreier of Washington. There were 118 co-sponsors, so you have 81 Republicans, 37 Democrats. That particular bill included language on the prohibition of purchases of milk by school districts from China. But the Senate version that was introduced by Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas did not. So the Senate version actually was a version that Congress moved forward with in the past year. And in November, the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act passed by voice vote, actually, on November 20th, passed the House by voice vote on December 15th of last year. And it was just signed by President Trump on January 14th of this year. So here's a chart that indicates kind of the increasing momentum. As you see over time, like this convergence of like a traditional coalition of advocates that put together partisan differences to pass through legislation. But this is, I think, a story of increasing momentum over time. So as you see, in 2018, there were only 13 co-sponsors. By the time you get to 2023, there are 134 co-sponsors. Now, most of those co-sponsors were Republican, but there are a fair number of Democrats co-sponsoring the legislation as well. You see a picture here of the two co-sponsors from the House. Representative Glenn Thompson, who's actually a descendant of a longtime descendant of a long line of dairy farmers in central Pennsylvania, and Congresswoman Schreier, who's a Democrat from Washington. She is the first pediatrician I think the first female pediatrician to be elected to United States Congress. So they work together towards passage of the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act. So I think the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act, I think, sets the stage for some potential other areas of cooperation as we move forward in the next 2 to 3 years of the second Trump presidential era. Crop insurance is one area where traditionally Republicans and Democrats from agricultural states have had agreements. If you look at prior farm bills, there's been a lot of cooperation across the aisle in the area of crop insurance. And if we think about crop insurance, the federal government offers the federal crop insurance program. They offer a federal crop insurance program, and this includes multi-peril crop insurance policies. And so for those of you who are not as familiar with crop insurance, multi-peril crop insurance protects against a variety of risks, including insect loss due to losses due to insects, losses due to weather events, so frost, hail, if there's a crop hail endorsement. So there are a number of risks that are covered. Colder than expected weather, warmer than expected weather. And there's two different types of policies. There's yield-based and then revenue-based. Yield-based policies will actually insure against or protect against a drop in yield from a particular crop. And then a revenue-based policy will protect against losses due to production revenue. So the producer can actually choose to either protect against a drop in yield or a drop in revenue from a particular crop. Now, the United States Department of Agriculture does set firm guidelines in the realm of crop insurance. So they do set, through the Risk Management Agency, the RMA, is the legislative entity or the entity within USDA that the administrative entity within USDA that manages a crop insurance program. They set deadlines for when a particular crop needs to be planted. So, for instance, in Minnesota, there's a large corn crop. RMA would set deadlines as to when that corn crop has to be planted by the producer in order to be insurable. Now, there are situations where, let's say, because of unforeseeable circumstances, that crop can't be planted. So let's say excessive flooding, like let's say there's a lot of moisture, a lot of rain, there's excessive flooding. There is a prevented planting insurance coverage that is included within those policies. So the producer gets an indemnity if they're unable to plant the crop by the planting deadline. Now, in the last few months, USDA issued an Expanding Access to Risk Protection, or EARP, final rule. And the intent of this was to modernize crop insurance policies. And it was actually quite beneficial for the definition of beginning farmers and ranchers. So in the past, the definition of beginning farmers and ranchers was those that have farmed for 5 years or less. This EARP final rule actually expands the definition of beginning farmers and ranchers to those to 10 years or less. So it incorporates more and more producers that are newer producers in agriculture into this definition of beginning farmers and ranchers. And that's important because beginning farmers and ranchers do receive crop insurance premium discounts. So there are discounts to try to incentivize beginning farmers and ranchers to go into agriculture. Now, this EIRP final rule, however, eliminates the buy-up option for crop insurance. So basically, buy-up means that instead of a flat percentage indemnity that's provided for in the MPCI policy, let's say a producer wants to purchase additional coverage. They can actually purchase additional coverage through a buy-up option to protect at a higher percentage level. So their indemnity would be at a much higher percentage level than 50 to 60%, whatever it is for that crop for prevented planting. The rationale behind USDA's rule was that this type of buy-up option really only benefited, their rationale is that it really benefits mainly producers in North and South Dakota. And they also had a rationale that in the past, when there were needs for indemnities due to prevented planting, that Congress would actually step in with ad hoc, like one-time payments for those producers. Now, in response to this rule, you see a bipartisan group of legislators that sent a letter on January 2nd, 2026 to USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins. And this group was actually a group of 19. There were 13 Republicans and 6 Democrats. Signatories included Deb Fischer, who's probably one of the more conservative members of the United States Senate, and then Adam Schiff, who's one of the more progressive voices in the Senate from California. So it's a group of legislators that are not only from North and South Dakota or the northern states. You have a good group of legislators there, 19 senators. Now, there hasn't been legislation that's been introduced to try to restore this buy-up coverage option. So I think they're probably waiting to hear from USDA RMA on how they intend to proceed with this, but they're requesting reversal of this USDA decision. And I think this, certainly provides an opportunity for convergence between the parties in the realm of crop insurance, as we've traditionally seen in the past. Moving on to wildfire risk. A piece of legislation that has been receiving a lot of attention actually in the last year is the Fix Our Forests Act. If we think about wildfire risk in the United States, look back at last year's devastating Los Angeles wildfires. There were over 400 people that died in the Los Angeles wildfires. There's destruction of over 16,000 homes, commercial properties, and other structures. It's unclear as to exactly how much the losses are from the Los Angeles wildfires, but there's been an estimate of $76 billion to $131 billion, with up to $45 billion in insured losses due to last year's Los Angeles wildfires. And that's just, one set of fires. If we look at 2026 thus far, this year, as of about 2 weeks ago, approximately 15,000 wildfires have already started. There's been over approximately 15,000 starts, burning approximately 1.5 million acres of land. Now, the number of starts that we've seen thus far in 2026 actually surpasses the highest number of starts within the first 3 months of a year within the past decade. If we think about the state of Nebraska, thankfully now the Morrill fire that started in Morrill County, Nebraska, there's a fire in the last couple of months. It burned over 640,000 acres and was the largest wildfire in the history of Nebraska. In fact, today, as I'm presenting here in Pennsylvania, I looked at my phone this morning, and there's an elevated risk of fires today in central Pennsylvania. We have a day that is a little bit warmer, low humidity. There's a lot of wind. And so the conditions are there, unfortunately, for wildfire risk. But we're seeing wildfire risk. It's not only an issue that a lot of people traditionally think it's the Western U.S. when they think of wildfires. They think of Colorado or Arizona or New Mexico or California. Wildfires, certainly present. Have been present in the Midwest, as we see in Nebraska. And we're looking at this past winter. There was record warmth and snow drought, and so 2026, unfortunately. The outlook for significant wildland fire. This is a couple of weeks ago. The National Interagency Fire Center released this map, and you can see where there's above significant wildland fire potential. Most of the state of New Mexico, as you see in this chart, most of the state of New Mexico is under risk of significant wildland fire potential. Good part of the state of Texas. And then if you look at the Southeast, the entire state, almost the entire state, essentially, of North Carolina, basically the entire state of South Carolina, the entire state of Florida, and large parts of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and then a piece of Louisiana as well. So you see that there's a significant potential for fires here in 2026, which has kind of led to the urgency of discussion of comprehensive forest legislation. Now, a little bit of information about the Fix Our Forests Act. There's a lot of debate over this particular bill. But the interesting provision that has received a lot of attention is that under current law, there is a categorical exclusion from review pursuant to NEPA. National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, if we think about NEPA, it's one of the most significant environmental laws. Requires, for major actions affecting, major governmental actions affecting the environment, there's a requirement for an environmental impact statement, or EIS. And then, of course, there's a public comment process where individuals can publicly comment on actions that significantly affect the quality of the environment. So the Fix Our Forests Act actually raises the exclusion of U.S. Forest Service and governmental actions from review from 3,000 acres to 10,000 acres. So this is a more than triple the amount of acreage that would be exempt from review for public comment. Interestingly, also, this legislation creates an interagency wildfire intelligence center. which would bring together agencies like the National Weather Service and have greater interagency cooperation to comprehensively analyze wildfire risks. So it'd be basically a National Weather Service for wildfires. And also significant in this legislation is it would limit litigation relating to fireshed management. And it would allow injunctions only in cases where, let's say, U.S. Forest Service has a proposal for a management proposal for, let's say, a controlled burn of a forest. The injunctions could only limit these actions if the project poses a quote unquote proximate and substantial environmental harm. So we're looking at a pretty high standard for review for injunctions. Of course, injunctions also come with its own own standard of review, but the standard would be substantial environmental harm would have to be shown by those who want to limit a project or limit a controlled burn, for instance, in a forest. This legislation has really divided environmental groups. Nature Conservancy and Environmental Defense Fund, they actually support the Fix Our Forests Act. Sierra Club, Earth Justice are organizations that oppose it. It's even divided Democrats. So one of the notable co-sponsors of the Fix Our Forests Act, interestingly, is Steny Hoyer, who's the former House Majority Leader. So where is the Fix Our Forests Act now? So it passed the House with the 279 to 141 vote in early January of last year. There were 215 Republicans in support, none opposed. 64 Democrats voted yes, and 141 no. In October, the legislation passed through Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. And I would say the prospects are quite positive for passage in 2026. So this would be the most comprehensive wildfire legislation that we would see in years. Question is, obviously wildfire risk is a significant issue. Many of the opponents of the legislation say, this is one step. However, there's more important steps that need to be taken, like mitigation of climate change risks, emissions, those types of arguments. But it looks promising that a bipartisan coalition will forge together to pass the Fix Our Forests Act. So that is another piece of legislation in the wake of the whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act that probably has a pretty good chance of passing. Now, it'll be, we'll see where things go. I suspect with the increased and elevated wildfire risk of this spring, we've already seen quite a few wildfires this year already at an alarming pace, that this legislation will probably make it through the Senate and be signed by President Trump in the next few months. That is my guess, but we shall see. One of the other things I want to talk about before I end my presentation today, a couple of issues, is a convergence between organic agriculture and the Make America Healthy Again movement. Interestingly enough, there have been a couple of articles have indicated, possible convergence. There's a reporter, Tim Heerden, wrote an article about the possibility, a news article about how there's been increasing interest from activists in the Make America Healthy Again movement with organic agriculture. And if we think about like the MAHA movement, there's a number of priorities. Generally speaking, one is eliminating artificial dyes and synthetic additives out of the food supply in the U.S., reducing the processed foods and federal nutrition programs, and then promoting alternatives to prescription drugs manufactured by large pharmaceutical companies. President Trump signed an executive order last year creating a Make America Healthy commission. And this commission had an assessment that indicated 4 factors that were contributing to chronic obesity and disease in the United States. One was poor diet. Another was aggregation of environmental chemicals. Third was lack of physical activity and chronic stress. And the fourth category, which is, it's kind of hard to explain this category. There's not a whole lot to explain this particular category, but over medicalization, whatever that means. I'm not sure what that means exactly. If we're talking about, is it vaccines? Is it just prescription medications in general? It's hard to know what over medicalization is, but over medicalization was one of the things that this commission noted. Now, I think one area where there definitely may be convergence is the Strengthening Local Processing Act of 2025. If we're thinking about like local meats, current federal law requires a producer to send their animals to USDA-approved slaughterhouses or state-inspected slaughterhouses in order to sell individual cuts of meat. And the issue here is that some producers have to actually send their animals hundreds of miles away, and then they to a facility for these inspections, and then also they may have to wait actually for months. Which slows up the availability of local meats at like your local grocery store, for instance. The Strengthening Local Processing Act of 2025, this actually increases the incentives for states to participate in state processing inspections. So the federal cost share for state meat and poultry inspections now is actually 50%. This legislation would increase that federal share of those costs to 65%. And the idea, of course, is to incentivize states to have more processing facilities. If you look at the co-sponsors in the House, you have Representative Chellie Pingree. Representative Pingree, a Democrat from Maine, is an organic farmer. And then you have Congressman Jim Baird of Republican of Indiana. And then in the Senate, you have John Thune and Martin Heinrich. John Thune, of course, Senate Majority Leader, Republican. Senator Martin Heinrich, a Democrat from New Mexico. So this is a legislation I think that probably has a chance where it may be a little more difficult. Is the Agricultural Resilience Act. But before I talk about the Agricultural Resilience Act, there is a potential alignment with the MAHA movement here, although the Agricultural Resilience Act, if you look at the legislation, it is very comprehensive. Some of the areas where there might be alignment would be the issue of standardizing food labels. Producers, there's no standardization of the food labels that are utilized by producers to indicate when food should be discarded. And of course, establishing programs to reduce food waste in landfills and schools is also a main part of the Agricultural Resilience Act. It also expands USDA programs and research for areas like soil health, in addition to climate change mitigation practices. More controversial within this legislation would be that there is a part of this legislation that requires USDA to implement a plan to achieve net zero carbon emissions from the ag sector by the year 2040. So we're looking at 14 years from now. USDA would have to have a plan to achieve net zero carbon emissions. If we look at the Agricultural Resilience Act that's currently co-sponsored by 21 Democrats in the House, there are no Republicans. There's parts of this bill, I think that there would probably be some alignment with the Make America Healthy Again movement. The net zero carbon emissions part, may be a bit more controversial. But looking at this legislation, maybe if it's a piecemeal approach, there are certainly some areas there where there may be convergence for bipartisan cooperation. And then the issue, I know this has been touched on earlier today, is glyphosate or Roundup in the United States. And so the last couple months, President Trump issued an executive order to invoke the Defense Production Act to ensure an adequate domestic supply of glyphosate. This has, of course, brought forward kind of an immediate reaction from a bipartisan coalition. And so one of the bills that was immediately sponsored in the United States House of Representatives is the No Immunity for Glyphosate Act. This is H.R. 7601. And this would actually create a federal cause of action in a U.S. district court that could be filed by any person who suffers a physical injury, disease, illness, or death caused by exposure to elemental phosphorus or glyphosate-based herbicide that is manufactured, supplied, distributed, or sold within the United States. And this, of course, this bill would provide for recovery of compensatory damages, punitive damages, as well as significantly attorney fees. And specifically, the bill does not, within its text, would not preempt any state law cause of action that may exist against a manufacturer, distributor, or seller of glyphosate. So this bill, of course, has been sponsored by Representative Thomas Massie, who's a more libertarian member of the U.S. House. It has 4 Democratic co-sponsors thus far, including Congressman Ro Khanna from California. And then it has also 3 Republican co-sponsors, Representative Nancy Mace from South Carolina, Representative Lauren Boebert from Colorado, and Representative Anna Paulina Luna from Florida. So you have a very interesting coalition of representatives that have combined on this issue. Now, I would say that the chances of this, being sent to the floor of the House are very slim to low. But it kind of indicates that, in some coalitions, there's been work kind of with the administration, and in this one, this is a bipartisan coalition kind of against the Trump administration in agricultural policy. So, in conclusion, where are we at here in 2026? Where do we stand? All things considered, I think this is a time that we can say there's cautious optimism. So in the midst of a time where there's very, very strong partisanship in the United States, there is some cautious optimism for bipartisanship in agricultural policy. And this, of course, is very important, especially as Congress debates and potentially debates the Farm Bill this year, the Comprehensive Farm Bill. And it's very interesting. Traditionally, we've had traditional coalitions that have forged the compromises of farm bills. You've had traditional coalitions of farm state legislators that have been from opposite parties that have forged together compromises to move forward farm bills. I would say today, even though there's a time for cautious optimism, considering some of the coalitions that have emerged in agricultural policies, I would characterize these coalitions that tend to be very mercurial. Very mercurial, I think, is a good word to put it, and unpredictable. Which that may be a positive thing for the common good in agricultural policy, but it could also make things much more unpredictable and maybe lead to collapse of. We hope that there's not a collapse of the Farm Bill, but a collapse of the Farm Bill. So very much in a mercurial and unpredictable time. But I think there is room for cautious optimism in agricultural policy. Once again, thank you for allowing me to have this opportunity to speak about this important issue. And I look forward to questions at this time. Thanks, everyone.
Professor Myerson, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for coming back to the University of St. Thomas, if only virtually. You're always welcome here. Thank you so much. Let me begin by posing if you will, a kind of structural question. That is the nature of partisanship and bipartisanship. And bipartisanship depends on a functioning premise. And that functioning premise begins with the phrase, we can all agree. And we can all agree that milk is a good thing, that we want healthy kids with calcium in their bodies and strong bones. We can all agree that farmers should not suffer catastrophic losses. We can all agree that wildfire should not burn out of control. Partisanship, on the other hand, is driven by a set of extrinsic factors. Cultural wedges, we cannot agree. They're going to take our guns, or they're going to poison the atmosphere. They're going to do these drastic, horrible things. And it leads to siloing into one's favored information ecology and things of this sort. And so what we're dealing with in your presentation at a structural level is the question between what counts as we can all agree and what counts as we have a cultural wedge here that is impossible to cleave. And I find interesting the reference to MAHA, Make America Healthy Again, because I find a lot of promise in that movement. But I also, as you point out, when you use the word mercurial, I looked at some of the personalities involved, and they tend to be, on both sides, the more theatrical personalities. And you have, in other words, a real risk of having this blow apart. But I think MAHA, especially if we're dealing with things like food additives, vaccines are a different, more controversial thing. But if we're dealing with things like food additives, I think the potential for bipartisan cooperation is there. If I may encourage you to consider in your introduction, writing your introduction, to focus on the distinction I drew between we can all agree and the areas where agreement, regrettably, has become impossible. Well, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the suggestion. I will certainly consider and reflect on those comments in the introduction. So thank you very much.
Questions from the audience? I'm looking out on a room of students who have one thing on their mind, I'm afraid, and that's lunch. Food.
Lunch.
We have lunch coming up.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I just, I think the world of the University of St. Thomas. It is, visiting it in person 5 years ago for the Common Good Symposium. Congratulations on all the great work that you're doing to educate lawyers for the common good. I know we all have our different backgrounds, our different values, our different views. But one of the wonderful things, as an alumnus of a Catholic law school myself, St. Louis University, one of the wonderful things is the focus on the common good. That we share a common humanity. This emphasis on the common good. So congratulations on all the great work you're doing in educating lawyers for that'll be out in the world and in various areas working toward the common good in whatever role that might be.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And if anyone ever has questions, please feel free to email me. I think my email is on the slides. I'll send the slides over to the journal as well, so the journal has those. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Marsden, and thank you all to the remaining panelists that we had. Thank you all for being able to make this such a wonderful and intellectually rigorous event. And thank you all to our journal members here. We appreciate your attendance today. And with that, that concludes the symposium. So thank you all.